11 years they called me cursed, Margaret Hale whispered, her lips barely moving, her hands trembling so hard she had to press them flat against her dress to stop the shaking. Standing at an altar she hadn't chosen, beside a man who hadn't asked in a church full of people who had come to watch her finally completely break. Jackson Cole felt her trembling beside him. He didn't look at her. His jaw was iron. His boots were rooted to the floor, like a man bracing against a storm he couldn't outride. Then Reverend Aldous said the words, and Margaret Hale lifted her chin and smiled. And Jackson Cole, for the first time in his life, forgot what he'd decided. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Margaret's journey all the way to the end. Leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The church was packed before 8 o'clock in the morning. That alone told Margaret everything she needed to know about what kind of day this was going to be. Willow Creek didn't fill its pews for weddings. It filled them for spectacles. And she had been the town's favorite spectacle for 11 years running. She stood outside the double doors in a dress that belonged to Mrs. Whitmore's younger sister, cream cotton, with a small tear at the left seam that Margaret had repaired herself at 4 in the morning, sitting alone by candlelight while the rest of the town slept. She had been awake since 2, not from nerves exactly, from the particular exhaustion of a woman who had learned long ago that sleeping through the night was a luxury people without enemies could afford. Inside, she could hear them. Not words, not yet just the low murmur of a crowd that had been waiting a long time for this exact moment. Reverend Aldous met her at the door. He was a thin man with kind eyes that couldn't quite hold her gaze this morning, and she respected him enough not to make it harder than it already was. "Miss Hale," he said quietly. Are you ready?" "I've been ready since 6, she said. "You're the one who made me wait out here." He blinked. Then, despite himself, he almost smiled. "Yes. Well, the groom has just arrived." "Late," she said. "He had some difficulties this morning." "I'm sure he did." She smoothed the front of her dress, lifted her chin exactly 1 precise inch, and said, "Open the door, Reverend." He opened the door. The sound that rose from the pews was not applause. It wasn't quite laughter either. It was something in between, a kind of collective intake of breath, followed by the specific murmur that only happens when a crowd has gathered to watch something they believe will be entertaining. Margaret walked down that aisle like she was walking across her own kitchen floor. She didn't rush. She didn't look down. She let her gaze move slowly, deliberately across the faces on either side of her, the Hendersons in the 3rd row. Clara Henderson, with her hand pressed to her mouth as if she were watching something mildly scandalous. The Beaumont sisters behind them, both already leaning toward each other to whisper. Old Silas Croft in the back corner with his arms crossed, and his expression the particular smug satisfaction of a man who had engineered something he considered deeply funny. She met every set of eyes that tried to slide away from her. She held them until they broke contact first. Halfway down the aisle she heard a woman's voice, young, not even trying to be quiet, say, "Lord, she's actually going to do it." Margaret didn't stop walking. At the altar, Jackson Cole was already standing. She had seen him before the way everyone in Willow Creek had seen him from a distance, mostly the big rancher who came into town twice a month for supplies and left without speaking to anyone he didn't have to. He was taller than she'd expected, or maybe it was the set of his shoulders that made him seem that way. Dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been hewn from something harder than ordinary men were made of, and an expression on his face that Margaret recognized immediately because she had worn it herself many times in many rooms. It was the expression of a person who had decided before walking in that they were not going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them flinch. She reached the altar and stood beside him. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him either. Reverend Aldous opened his Bible and began to speak, and the murmuring in the pews slowly dropped to a watchful, waiting silence. 3 days earlier, Margaret had been in the back room of Whitmore's general store, doing what she did every Tuesday, helping Mrs. Whitmore reconcile the accounts ledger, which the older woman's failing eyesight had made increasingly difficult. It was quiet work, careful work, the kind Margaret was good at. She didn't mind it. She minded very little that was quiet. She had been halfway through the second column of figures when Mrs. Whitmore had come in and closed the door behind her with a deliberateness that made Margaret set down her pen. "There's something I have to tell you," the older woman said, "and I want you to know that I fought against it. I want that to be very clear." "What happened?" Margaret said. "Judge Harrington called a meeting this morning at the courthouse." Mrs. Whitmore sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "You know about the government relief contract, the one that determines the land rights for the Eastern Grazing Territory." Margaret knew. Everyone in Willow Creek knew. The contract had been the source of tension for 2 years. It required the holder of the Eastern Territory to demonstrate what the federal language called settled domestic establishment. It was bureaucratic wording that meant in plain terms a married man with a household. The territory's value was substantial. Several men in town had already positioned themselves to benefit if Jackson Cole lost his claim. "Jackson Cole doesn't have a wife," Margaret said slowly. "He has 30 days to get one, or he forfeits the contract and the land title reverts to the county for redistribution." Mrs. Whitmore's hands were folded tightly in her lap. "The judge called the meeting to formalize the arrangement, to make it official." "And what does this have to do with me?" The older woman looked at her for a long moment. "They took a vote, Margaret." The silence that followed was the specific kind that lands differently than ordinary silence. "A vote," Margaret said, "among the eligible women of the county, or rather among the women the judge determined were eligible." Mrs. Whitmore's jaw tightened. It was framed as a charitable offering, a chance for a woman of limited prospects to secure a respectable position. "Limited prospects," Margaret repeated. She kept her voice entirely level. She had had 11 years of practice keeping her voice entirely level. "You were the only name put forward," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly, "because you were the only woman the town believed, the only woman they said that no decent man would choose voluntarily." There it was, laid out plain the way ugly things rarely were. Margaret sat with it for a moment. Outside the back room, she could hear the shop bell ring as someone came in through the front door, and she heard Mrs. Whitmore's assistant greeting them with a cheerful good morning, and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning in a town that had just voted her into a forced marriage and considered it a favor. "What does Jackson Cole think about this?" she asked. "He was told this morning, by the judge directly." Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. "He didn't refuse." "That's not the same as agreeing." "No," the older woman said. "It isn't." Margaret picked up her pen. She looked at the half-finished column of figures. Then she set the pen back down. "What time is the ceremony?" she asked. Jackson Cole had spent the 2 days before the wedding trying to find a way out of it that wouldn't cost him everything he had built in 15 years. There wasn't one. He'd ridden out to see Judge Harrington the morning after the meeting and laid his objections out plainly. He was a man who preferred plain speech. He told the judge that he had no quarrel with the contract requirements, that he understood the legal framework, but that forcing a marriage on a woman who hadn't chosen it was not something he was willing to participate in, regardless of the land at stake. Judge Harrington had listened to all of this with the patience of a man who had already thought through every objection and found them irrelevant. "Mr. Cole," he said when Jackson had finished, "the woman in question has been informed and has given her consent." Her consent to what exactly? To being the option nobody else wanted. Her consent to the arrangement. Those were her words. The judge folded his hands on the desk. "I'll be honest with you, because I think you're an honest man. Miss Hale is 32 years old. She has lived in this town for 11 years with a reputation that makes her invisible to most of the men who might otherwise have considered her. She has no family support. She has no property. She works in other people's businesses for wages that barely sustain her. This arrangement offers her stability, a home, legal standing. Whatever you may think of the circumstances, those are real things." Jackson said nothing for a moment. Then, "And what does she get out of a husband who doesn't want to be married?" "A roof and a contract," the judge said. which is more than she has now. He had ridden home with that answer sitting in his chest like a stone, and he had not been able to dislodge it in the 2 days since. He didn't want a wife. He had made peace with that a long time ago. His ranch was his world, the land, the cattle, the work that started before sunrise and didn't end until the stars came out. And he had built it alone, and he preferred it that way. He was not a man who found it easy to share space or decisions, or the particular silence of a house after a long day. He had tried once to imagine something different. He had stopped trying, but he also understood as clearly as he understood anything that what was being done to Margaret Hale was not something a woman chose freely, and the fact that she had said yes, whatever that yes had cost her, meant something he couldn't entirely dismiss. So he'd arrived at the church at 8:15, which was late because his foreman's horse had thrown a shoe on the road and Jackson had stopped to help him, which was the kind of thing he did without thinking about it. The same way he couldn't stop thinking about the woman waiting at the church, who had said yes to a marriage with a man who hadn't even spoken to her yet. "Do you, Jackson Elias Cole, take this woman?" "I do." The words came out flat. Not cold exactly, but compressed like a man who was conserving air. Margaret registered the flatness and filed it away. He was not a man who was here willingly. She had already known that. It was useful to have it confirmed so quickly. "And do you, Margaret Ann Hale, take this man?" "I do," she said. Her voice came out clear and steady, and she heard a small ripple move through the pews, a collective surprise that she was going to do this without breaking, without tears, without the visible evidence of humiliation they had come to see. She didn't give them any. Reverend Aldous pronounced them married, and Margaret turned to face her husband for the first time. He was looking at her, not with the contempt she had half expected, not with the pity that would have been worse. He was looking at her with the expression she couldn't immediately read, careful measuring, like a man doing math in his head about a problem more complicated than he'd been told. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then, because she had learned a long time ago that the only armor she had that no one could take from her was the one thing they expected her not to have, she did the thing that she had taught herself to do in the worst moments. She smiled. Not a performance, not defiance exactly. A quiet, settled smile that came from somewhere so deep in her that it startled even her a little. The smile of a woman who had decided in the dark at 4 a.m, while she repaired a borrowed dress that she was going to walk through this day as herself, and not as anyone's version of what a broken woman was supposed to look like. Jackson Cole blinked. In 11 years, no one had ever looked at Margaret Hale the way he looked at her in that moment. Not with desire. Not yet, not with any of the softness that would come later. But with something that was the beginning of all of it, genuine, unguarded confusion. Like a man who had arrived expecting something entirely different, and found standing in its place something he didn't have a word for yet. Behind them, the town went oddly quiet. Cha. They rode to the ranch in silence. Jackson's wagon, his horse tied to the back, her single trunk loaded in the bed. The road out of Willow Creek ran northeast, and the country opened up as the last buildings fell away. Wide sky, long grass, the particular smell of Montana territory in the early morning that Margaret had always privately loved and never told anyone because loving things had a way of costing her. She sat on the wagon bench beside him and looked at the land and said nothing. He said nothing either. They were 4 miles out when he finally spoke. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, "about the situation." "Please," she said. "The ranch runs on a strict schedule. My foreman Dale Pruitt manages the workers. I don't expect you to involve yourself in the operation." He kept his eyes on the road. "You'll have the house, your own room, whatever you need to make it livable. I'll provide for you. That's not in question." "What is in question?" she said. He glanced at her. "I didn't ask for this." "I know that. And I want you to understand that I'm not the kind of man who—" He stopped, started again. "I'll treat you with respect. That's the whole of what I can promise right now." Margaret considered this for a moment. "That's more than most people in that church have offered me in 11 years, she said. "I'll take it." He looked at her again longer this time. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something different. Something easier to dismiss," she said pleasantly. He didn't answer that, but his jaw shifted slightly, and she filed that away too. The ranch was larger than she had imagined. Not just the house, though the house was substantial, built solid and square against the Montana wind. The kind of structure that had been put up by a man who intended to stay but the whole operation. Barns outbuildings, a bunkhouse for the hands' corrals running along the eastern fence line, a kitchen garden behind the main house that had been maintained with inconsistent attention and clearly needed someone who wasn't too proud to pull weeds. Dale Pruitt met them at the front of the house. He was a wiry man in his 40s with a wind-burned face and the careful stillness of someone who had learned to read his employer's moods from a distance. He looked at Margaret with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, purely assessing the way a man looks at a new piece of equipment he's not sure yet is the right one for the job. "Mrs. Cole," he said, because he was a practical man. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. "How many workers on the property currently?" He blinked. 11. "Why?" "I'd like to know who I'm sharing a household operation with," she said. "Are any of them dealing with anything that affects their work injuries illness?" Pruitt looked at Jackson. Jackson looked at Pruitt. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Tom Barker's been riding hurt for 2 weeks," Pruitt said finally, as if the words came out against his better judgment. "Cracked a rib. Won't admit it keeps working anyway. He needs to rest the rib for at least another week, or he'll crack it properly," Margaret said. "What's he doing that he can be shifted off without losing the work?" "He's on fence repair on the north line." "Can someone else cover the north line for a week?" "I suppose." "Then have someone cover it," she said. "A man working with a cracked rib makes mistakes. Mistakes on a working ranch cost more than a week of shifted labor." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not telling you how to manage your workers, Mr. Pruitt. I'm just telling you what I see." Pruitt looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at Jackson again. Jackson had been watching this entire exchange with the expression of a man who had opened a door expecting a closet and found a room he hadn't known was there. "I'll see about Tom," Pruitt said carefully, and excused himself. Margaret picked up her own trunk. Jackson reached for it automatically, and she waved him off and carried it to the front door. "You didn't have to do that," Jackson said, following her. "Have someone look after Tom Barker." "Talk to my foreman like that." "Like what?" she said. "I was direct. He seems like a man who prefers direct." "He does," Jackson said. "That's not, I just didn't expect." "You keep saying that," she said. "What?" "That I'm not what you expected." She set the trunk down inside the door and turned to face him in the entryway of his house. Her house now technically by law and contract, though she held that thought loosely the way she held most things. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I understand this is not what either of us would have chosen. I understand that you are going to spend some time waiting for me to be a problem. That's all right. But I'm going to do what I do, which is see what's in front of me and deal with it. And eventually, you'll either get used to that or you won't. Either way, the ranch still needs to run." He stared at her. "You've been here 20 minutes. "I know." "And you've already given your foreman one practical suggestion." "Yes." She held his gaze. "Was I wrong about the rib?" He said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "No, I've been meaning to say something to Tom myself." "Then we agree on something," she said. "That's a start." Meg. She found the ledger books that afternoon in the small room off the kitchen that had been used as a kind of catch-all office financial record supply, invoices, ranch journals going back several years. Jackson had not offered to show her this room. She had found it herself while learning the layout of the house, which she did with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that knowing the geography of a space was not a luxury, but a form of protection. She didn't ask permission to look at the books. She sat down at the desk, opened the most recent ledger, and began reading. By the time Jackson came in for supper, a meal that Margaret had assembled from what was in the kitchen, With the efficiency of someone who had been cooking for herself for a decade, she had found 3 significant inefficiencies in the supply contracts and 2 patterns of expenditure that didn't align with the production records. She said nothing about any of it at supper. He sat across from her at the long kitchen table that had clearly been designed for more people than had used it in years, and she set food in front of him and sat down with her own plate, and they ate in silence for a while. "You didn't have to cook," he said finally. "I know," she said. "But the alternative was neither of us eating, since I didn't see any evidence that the kitchen has been used for anything more involved than coffee in some time." He had no answer for that. "The biscuits are good," he said after another pause. "My mother's recipe," she said. She was a practical woman. She died when I was 20. She said it simply without performing grief. It was an old fact now. My father before that. I've been on my own for a while. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said. "It made me capable." He picked up his coffee cup, put it down, looked at her with that measuring expression again. "Where did you learn about cracked ribs?" "My mother had a medical guide. I read everything I could get my hands on when I was young. There wasn't much else to do, and reading didn't require other people's permission." She looked at him evenly. "I also have a practical knowledge of accounting crop rotation herbal medicine and the legal statutes of Montana Territory as they pertain to property rights and contract law." She paused. "In case any of that is relevant." He set the coffee cup down very slowly. "Why do you know the property statutes?" "Because 11 years ago," she said, "a man tried to take the house I was renting by claiming the lease had a defective clause. I had to prove him wrong myself, because there was no one else to do it." She looked at him steadily. "I won." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the very beginning of something that might eventually become it. A recalibration. A quiet realization that the woman sitting across from him was not the woman anyone in Willow Creek had told him she was. 11 years, he said. "You've been alone here 11 years. "In Willow Creek, yes," she said. "Why didn't you leave?" She looked down at her plate. When she looked back up, her expression was still composed, but there was something underneath it now, not pain exactly, but the controlled recognition of pain, the way a person references a scar they've learned to live with. "Because leaving felt like proving them right," she said, "and I am not in the habit of proving people right when they're wrong." Wronged. She didn't sleep well that night. She hadn't expected to. The house was quiet, in the way unfamiliar houses are quiet, full of new sounds that her nervous system hadn't categorized yet. The wind working against different corners than she was used to, the creak of floorboards settling in patterns she didn't know. She lay on the narrow bed in her room. Her room, he had said without hesitation, without any suggestion of anything other than that, and stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular, which was how she thought when there was too much to think about. She thought about the way the town had looked at her walking down that aisle. She thought about Silas Croft in the back corner with his arms crossed. She thought about the way Jackson Cole had looked at her when she smiled, that blink, that unguarded confusion, as if she had done something he didn't have a category for. She thought about the ledger books, the supply contracts, the numbers that didn't quite add up in ways that could mean simple inefficiency or could mean something else entirely. She was going to have to be careful. She was going to have to be very, very careful. Not because she was afraid. Fear was something she had burned through a long time ago, the way you burn through the first layer of anything painful and come out the other side with something harder and more durable. But because this was a situation with real stakes, and she was in it with a man she didn't know yet, in a house she didn't know on land that had already been the subject of legal maneuvering, and she had learned the hard way that the time to pay attention was before anything went wrong, not after. She fell asleep near midnight, with the ledger figures still moving behind her eyes. 3 days into her time at the ranch, Dale Pruitt came to find her. She was in the kitchen garden when he appeared at the gate, that same carefully assessing expression, but something had shifted in it. A fraction less reservation, a fraction more curiosity. Tom Barker's sleeping regular again, he said. First time in 2 weeks. Good, she said without looking up from the row she was working. How'd you know it was a cracked rib and not a pulled muscle? The way he was holding his left arm, she said, slightly away from his body. A pulled muscle does the opposite, you guard it by pressing in. A rib fracture you guard by creating space. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. You ever work on a ranch before? No, she said. But I've paid attention to people my whole life. It's a cheaper education than most and more useful than some. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. Mr. Pruitt, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you tell me stays between us. All right, he said cautiously. The feed supplier contracts, the ones from 18 months ago. Did Mr. Cole renegotiate them, or did someone do it on his behalf? Pruitt's face went still. Why? Because the new rates are 11% higher than the previous contracts, and the delivery volumes decreased at the same time. I looked at the production numbers. The ranch didn't need less feed, so either someone made a bad deal, or someone made a good deal for themselves. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. I handled the renegotiation, Pruitt said slowly. I was told to. By who? By Mr. Cole. Or by someone speaking for Mr. Cole. I was in the field. The message came through Croft. The name landed quietly between them like a stone dropped into still water. Silas Croft, Margaret said. He was doing some legal work for the ranch at the time, Pruitt said. Or so Cole thought. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. Did you tell Mr. Cole about the rate change? I assumed he knew. It came from him. It didn't come from him, she said. I've been through the records. There's no notation in his personal journals about the renegotiation. He keeps detailed notes, dates, decisions, reasons. It's not there. Pruitt stared at her. You've read his journals. The operational journals, she said. Yes, they were in the office with the ledgers. I read everything that was available. She looked at him steadily. I'm not here to cause trouble, Mr. Pruitt. I'm here because I'm apparently the only person who has sat down with the complete records and read them from beginning to end. And what I'm seeing in them is a pattern that someone has worked very hard to make look like ordinary ranch business. Pruitt's jaw tightened. What kind of pattern? The kind that if it continues will make it look like this ranch is operating at a loss, she said, right before the contract renewal. She let that sit for a moment. The government relief contract, Pruitt said slowly. The one Croft. The one that required Mr. Cole to be married, she said. Yes. They looked at each other. He's been setting this up, Pruitt said. It wasn't a question. I think so, she said. I need more records to be certain, but I think Silas Croft has been positioning himself to benefit from Jackson Cole losing this ranch for at least 18 months, and the marriage requirement was the final piece. She paused. The town vote wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. If Cole married a woman with no standing, no connections, no credibility, a woman everyone already dismissed, then even if she noticed something wrong, no one would listen to her. The silence stretched out. They picked you on purpose, Pruitt said. I believe so, she said calmly. It was a very good plan. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. What are you going to do? Margaret picked up her gardening tools and turned toward the house. Find proof, she said, and then we'll see. That night, Jackson came into the office and found her at the desk with the ledgers spread open around her, a lamp burning, and 3 pages of her own notes set to one side in her precise small handwriting. He stopped in the doorway. You've been in here since supper? Yes. It's past 10. I know. He came in and stood behind her, looking over her shoulder at the open ledger. He was close enough that she was aware of him in the specific way you become aware of people who take up a lot of space, not unpleasantly, just a fact of the room. What are you looking for? He asked. She hesitated for one moment. Just one. She had been thinking about how to have this conversation for 3 days, about how much to tell him and when and in what order. Because the truth she was beginning to piece together was the kind that could make a man react in several ways, not all of them productive. But she looked at his reflection in the dark window opposite the desk, the set of his jaw, the steadiness in his eyes that she had been reading and recalibrating for 3 days, and she made a decision. "Sit down," she said. "There's something you need to know about Silas Croft." He sat down. She told him everything she had found. She laid it out the way she laid out ledger figures, clearly in sequence, without embellishment, letting the facts carry the weight. The feed contracts, the missing notations in his journals, the pattern of small financial adjustments that individually looked like normal variants, but together described a deliberate, sustained effort to degrade the apparent profitability of the ranch before a contract renewal. He listened without interrupting. His expression moved through several things she tracked carefully. Surprise, then a particular kind of controlled anger that a certain type of man produces when he realizes he has been outmaneuvered, then something harder and quieter underneath that. When she finished, the room was quiet. "How long?" he said. "At minimum 18 months, she said. "Possibly longer. I'd need the records from before that to be certain." "Why didn't Pruitt?" "He didn't know," she said. "The message that came through Croft looked like it came from you. Pruitt had no reason to question it." She paused. People rarely question things that fit the shape of what they expect. Jackson's hands were flat on the surface of the desk. She could see the effort it was taking him to hold himself still. "And the marriage," he said. "You think—" "I think the marriage requirement was a piece of it, yes," she said carefully. "Whether Croft influenced the judge or simply worked with what was already in motion, I can't prove that yet. But the timing is not a coincidence." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "And they chose you because they thought you'd be easy to overlook." "Yes," she said simply. He looked at her. The lamp threw light across his face, and she could see him thinking, working through it the way a man does when the ground he was standing on has shifted, and he's taking stock of what he's still standing on. "They miscalculated," he said. "Considerably," she agreed. He looked at her for another moment. Then, something crossed his face that she hadn't seen on it before. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of something that might eventually become warmth. A respect that had come the hard way, the way all real respect does. "We'll need to be careful," he said. "If Croft knows you've been looking at the records—" "He doesn't know yet," she said. "But he will. Men like that always find out. Then we don't have much time." "No," she agreed. "We don't." They sat in the lamplight in the office of his ranch. Her notes spread between them, the ledger open to a page full of numbers that told a story someone had worked very hard to keep hidden, and they looked at each other across the desk with the particular recognition of two people who have realized unexpectedly that they are on the same side. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and dark and full of everything that had not yet happened. Inside, something that had no name yet had begun. Jackson didn't sleep that night either. She could tell by the sound of boots on floorboards sometime after midnight, slow, deliberate pacing in the room directly below hers, the particular rhythm of a man working something through in his body because his mind had already exhausted itself on it. She recognized that rhythm. She had worn it herself for years. She didn't go down. It wasn't her place yet, and she understood the difference between caring about someone's distress and inserting yourself into it uninvited. So she lay in the dark and listened to him pace, and she thought about Silas Croft, and 18 months of quiet, patient corruption, and she made a mental list of everything she still needed to find. At 5:30, she got up, dressed, and went to the kitchen. He was already there. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him, and the look of a man who had been sitting in the same place for a long time. He glanced up when she came in. Neither of them said anything about the pacing or the cold coffee, or what it meant that they were both awake before dawn for the second reason in a row. She put the coffee on and started on breakfast and said, "I need to go into town today." "Why?" "Because there's a woman there who knows things I need to know," she said, And because if I stay off the main street for too long, people will start talking about what I'm doing out here, and that kind of attention is useful to Croft right now. He watched her move around the kitchen. You want to go back into Willow Creek 4 days after the wedding. I want to walk into that town like a woman who has nothing to hide and nothing to fear and nothing to prove, she said. Because that's the only position from which I can do anything useful. He was quiet for a moment. I'll take you. I don't need an escort. I know, he said. I'll take you anyway. She turned from the stove and looked at him. He looked back at her with the same steady expression he'd had since the first morning, that careful measuring quality that she was beginning to understand was not coldness but precision. He was a man who did not say things he didn't mean, and he had just said he would come with her. All right, she said. The road into Willow Creek was the same road she had ridden out on 4 days ago, but it felt different going back. Everything looked the same. The air smelled the same. But she had changed her address and her legal name, and somehow rearranged the architecture of her life in 96 hours. And the road didn't know any of that, which struck her as faintly absurd. Jackson drove. She sat beside him. They didn't talk for the first 2 miles, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of two people who were still figuring out where the edges of each other were. Tell me about Croft, she said finally. What do you want to know? How long has he been handling legal work for the ranch? 2 years roughly. Jackson kept his eyes on the road. He came recommended by the county clerk's office. Said he specialized in land contracts, which is what I needed at the time. The government relief contract requires a lot of paperwork, a lot of filings, a lot of renewal documentation. I don't have the patience for bureaucratic language. I hired him to handle it. Did you review what he filed on your behalf? A pause. Short, but she caught it. I trusted him to do the work correctly. That's not the same thing, she said gently. No, he said. It isn't. She let that sit for a moment. He was in a position to see the entire framework of the contract. Every condition, every requirement, every clause that could be used as leverage. Including the domestic establishment requirement, Jackson said quietly. Including that. She folded her hands in her lap. He knew about the 30-day provision before anyone else did, because he filed the renewal documentation. He would have known months in advance. Enough time to put things in place, Jackson said. Enough time to put a great many things in place, she agreed. The wagon rolled through the edge of town, and she felt the shift in the air, the way she always did when she crossed from the open country into Willow Creek. The slight compression, the sense of being watched from multiple directions simultaneously. She had lived with that sense for 11 years. It was almost comfortable in the way that chronic discomfort eventually becomes the baseline. People noticed them. Of course they did. Jackson Cole coming into town 4 days after his forced wedding was not a routine event. And the woman sitting beside him on the wagon bench was not a woman anyone was accustomed to seeing in that position. She kept her chin level and her gaze forward and let them look. Mrs. Whitmore's shop was quiet in the late morning, the way it usually was between the early rush and the midday trade. Margaret came through the door and the bell rang above her, and the older woman looked up from behind the counter, and her expression went through several things very quickly. Relief. Something close to guilt, and then a careful, watchful attention. Margaret, she said. Good morning, Margaret said pleasantly. I need to speak with you, in the back. Mrs. Whitmore looked past her at the door where Jackson had stopped at the threshold. He looked at Margaret. She gave him the smallest nod. He stayed outside. In the back room with the door closed, Margaret sat down in the same chair she had been sitting in when she learned about the wedding, and Mrs. Whitmore sat across from her, and the two women looked at each other. You look well, the older woman said carefully. I am well, Margaret said, and I need to know something, and I need you to tell me the truth, even if you think the truth will upset me, because I think we are well past the point where protecting me from information serves any useful purpose. Mrs. Whitmore's hands folded in her lap. What do you want to know? When Silas Croft came to town 2 years ago, Margaret said, "What did he know about my history here, and who told him?" The silence that followed was the kind that confirmed a suspicion before a word was spoken. "Agnes," Mrs. Whitmore said finally. "Agnes Beaumont. She and Croft she was friendly with him in the early days, before anyone understood what kind of man he was." "And Agnes Beaumont knows everything," Margaret said. "She's lived here 30 years, the older woman said quietly. "She knows everything about everyone." "Including about Thomas," Margaret said. The name settled into the room like a stone. Mrs. Whitmore looked at her with something complicated and heavy in her expression. "Yes," she said, "including about Thomas." "So Croft knew," Margaret said. "Before he started working for Jackson Cole, before any of this was put in motion, he already knew the one thing about me that made me the perfect choice." "What thing?" Mrs. Whitmore asked carefully. "That I would never defend myself publicly," Margaret said. "Because to defend myself, I would have had to tell the truth about Thomas Reed. And I had decided a long time ago not to do that." She paused. "He knew I would take whatever was done to me quietly. He knew I was safe to use." Mrs. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. "Margaret," she said, "what really happened with Thomas?" Shawnee. Margaret had not told that story in 11 years. She had not told it to anyone, not even to herself in any direct way. She had boxed it and stored it and built her life around the box, the way you learn to navigate a room with a piece of furniture in it you can't move. She told it now, not because the timing felt right, it didn't particularly, but because Mrs. Whitmore was the one person in Willow Creek who had been consistently, stubbornly kind to her across 11 years of being the town's easiest target. And because Margaret had realized somewhere between midnight and 5:30 in the morning that the era of keeping this particular thing to herself had ended. Thomas Reed had been 28 when he came to Willow Creek. She had been 21. He was charming in the way certain men are charming completely naturally without apparent effort, the kind of charm that makes everyone around a person feel specifically seen. He had that gift, and she had fallen for it the way young women fall for things that feel like sunlight after a long winter. They were engaged within 6 months. She had believed herself in that particular way of young certainty to be the luckiest woman alive. What she had not known, what she did not find out until 3 weeks before their wedding date, was that Thomas Reed had a wife already, in Billings, and 2 children under 5 years old. She found out from a letter that arrived at the wrong address, and that she opened in good faith because the name on it was close to her own. And what she read in it remade her understanding of the past 6 months in the space of 5 minutes. She had confronted him, privately. She had given him the privacy of it, because even in her devastation, she was aware that there were children involved, and a woman in Billings who had not done anything to deserve having her life exposed in a small Montana town. He left Willow Creek the next morning, and because he left without explanation, and because they had been engaged, and because Margaret refused to explain why she had ended it, the town filled the silence with its own story. The story they settled on, the one that Agnes Beaumont had helpfully shaped and circulated, was that Thomas Reed had come to his senses about Margaret Hale, that she had been too odd, too bookish, too difficult, that a man with real prospects couldn't be expected to settle for a woman like that. She had let them believe it, because the alternative was telling the truth about a man who had children who didn't deserve to have their father's shame become public record, and she was not willing to do that even for herself. "That's what happened," she said. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without performance. "I kept quiet to protect people who had nothing to do with it. And the town spent 11 years deciding that my silence was evidence." Mrs. Whitmore had both hands over her mouth. When she took them away, her eyes were bright with something that wasn't quite tears. "Margaret, why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because telling you would have meant telling everyone eventually," she said. "And I couldn't take that risk." She paused. "But Croft knew. Or he knew enough. He knew there was something I was protecting, and that meant I was manageable. That's all he needed." "What are you going to do?" Mrs. Whitmore whispered. Margaret stood up. "I'm going to prove what he's doing to Jackson Cole's ranch," she said. "And then I'm going to make sure he doesn't get to do it to anyone else." She opened the back room door. "Margaret," Mrs. Whitmore said, and she stopped. "You should know he was in here 2 days ago. Croft. He was asking how you seemed, whether you looked settled in at the ranch." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you seemed perfectly content." The older woman's chin came up slightly. "I may have also mentioned that Mr. Cole seemed quite taken with you already." Margaret looked at her for a moment. "Why?" "Because I wanted to unsettle him," Mrs. Whitmore said simply. "And because I thought it might be useful for people to believe that the two of you are that theirs, I thought it might make him less certain he can predict what you'll do." Margaret considered this. "That was good thinking," she said. "Thank you." Jackson was waiting outside. He had been talking to the hardware store owner across the street, which was useful cover, and he fell into step beside her when she came out without any visible curiosity about how long she'd been inside or what she'd discussed. She appreciated that more than she would have known how to say. "Anything?" he asked quietly when they were far enough from the storefronts that no one could hear. "Yes," she said. "He knew my history before he started any of this. The whole arrangement was constructed around the assumption that I would be too compromised to be a credible witness to anything I found." Jackson's jaw tightened. "He used you." "He used both of us," she said. "You're the rancher losing his land. I'm the disgraced old maid who no one will listen to. Together, we're the perfect situation for a man who needs both things to be happening at the same time and for no one to connect them." "Except you did." "Except I did." She agreed. They walked in silence for a moment. On the opposite side of the street, she saw the Beaumont sisters come out of the milliner's shop and stop when they saw her. She looked directly at both of them and nodded pleasantly. Agnes Beaumont looked away first. "There's something else," Margaret said. "Tell me. Croft was asking about us 2 days ago, about how things appeared to be going at the ranch. He's monitoring the situation." She kept her voice low and level. "Which means he's watching for signs that something has changed. That we're not what he expected us to be." What did he expect? A rancher who's angry and humiliated about being forced into a marriage, she said, and a wife with no standing, no influence, and no idea what's going on around her. She glanced at him sideways. "He expected us to be a disaster for each other, which would keep you occupied and keep me irrelevant." Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's going to find out you've been looking at the records." "Yes, eventually." She stopped walking. They were at the wagon now, and she put one hand on the sideboard and looked at him directly. "When he does, he's going to move faster. We need to be ready before that happens." "Ready how?" Jackson asked. "I need 3 more things," she said. "I need the original filing documents from when Croft first registered as your legal representative. I need the correspondence records from the county clerk's office. And I need someone in this town who knows what Croft has actually been filing on your behalf, because I don't think everything he filed matches what he told you he was filing." Jackson looked at her for a moment. "You think he's been filing false documentation? I think he's been filing documentation that will look at contract renewal time like evidence that this ranch is a poor candidate for continued government consideration," she said. "And I think if we don't find it and counter it before the renewal date, you'll lose the land regardless of anything else we do." "When is the renewal date?" 6 weeks, she said. He absorbed that. She watched him do it the particular way a man processes information that is both worse than he feared and more urgent than he'd prepared for. His expression didn't collapse. It settled into something harder and more focused. "All right," he said. "Get in the wagon." Judd. They were halfway home when he spoke again. "You said there was something you were protecting," he said. "The reason you never defended yourself." She had not told him that part. She had told Mrs. Whitmore because the moment had called for it, but she had not decided yet how much of Thomas Reed belonged in a conversation with Jackson Cole. "There was," she said carefully. "You don't have to tell me what it was," he said. His voice was even, not pressing, just present. "I know," she said. They rode for another mile. The country opened wide on either side the way it did out here, and she felt the familiar loosening in her chest. That open land produced in her a kind of relief at the scale of things, the way the sky made human-sized troubles the right size. "Thomas Reed," she said. "He was a man I was engaged to, 11 years ago." She told him the bare bones of it. Not the full story she'd given Mrs. Whitmore, just the essential shape. He listened the way he listened to everything, without interrupting, with the focused attention of a man who understood that listening was a form of action. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then, "You protected his children." "I protected the situation," she said. "The children were part of it. You spent 11 years being called cursed and unwanted, and—" He stopped, started again, and she could hear the effort in it. "You let them say all of that because you wouldn't expose a man who deceived you in front of his own kids. When you say it like that, it sounds exactly like what it is," he said. And his voice had something in it now that she hadn't heard before, a roughness, a barely controlled edge that wasn't anger at her, but was very clearly anger on her behalf, which was a thing she had so little experience with that she didn't know immediately what to do with it. She looked at her hands in her lap. "It was my choice," she said. "I don't want anyone's pity for it." "That's not what I'm offering," he said. He said it simply, flatly, the way he said everything important. "I'm telling you that what you did was harder than anything most people ever do, and the town made you pay for it anyway." A pause. "And then they handed you to me like a problem to be managed." "Yes," she said quietly. "And you smiled," he said. "Walking down that aisle, you smiled." She didn't answer immediately. The wagon rolled through the ranch gate, and the familiar sounds of the working property came around them. Horses, cattle. Somewhere distant, the particular ongoing noise of a place that ran on labor and intention. "I decided a long time ago," she said finally, "that the only thing they couldn't take from me was the way I chose to face them. So I chose to face them like a woman who wasn't afraid." She paused. "The smile wasn't brave. It was just the only weapon I had left." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake, and he turned to look at her with an expression that she had not seen on him before, and couldn't entirely catalog, something open in it, raw in a way he probably hadn't intended, the look of a man who has just understood something he didn't expect to understand. "It wasn't just a weapon," he said quietly. She didn't ask him what he meant. She already knew on some level. She hadn't fully acknowledged yet the way you know things before you're ready to say them out loud. She climbed down from the wagon and went inside. Dale Pruitt found her that afternoon in the office. She had been through 2 more years of ledger books by then, and the pattern she'd identified was sharper now, more legible. The way a shape becomes clearer, the more of it you can see. Croft's fingerprints were everywhere, once you knew how to look for them. Small adjustments, subtle misdirections, entries that looked routine until you compared them against the original contracts. "I need to tell you something," Pruitt said, closing the office door behind him. "About the county clerk." She looked up. "His name's Alderman, Robert Alderman. He and Croft were in the same outfit during the war. Served together for 2 years. Pruitt's expression was tight. "I should have mentioned that before. I didn't think it mattered." Margaret set down her pen. "It matters," she said. "Very much. If Alderman is handling the contract filings, and Croft has known him for 20 years, then what Croft files and what gets recorded might not be the same document," Pruitt said. "Which means the paper trail I'm following might already be compromised," she said. "Yes." They looked at each other. "Who else?" she said. "Who else does Croft have relationships with in the county structure?" Pruitt thought for a moment. Judge Harrington played poker with him twice a month before Croft stopped showing up to the games. He paused. "Which was about 6 months ago, right around the time the contract renewal came up." Margaret absorbed this slowly. Judge Harrington. Who had arranged the marriage? who had cast it as charity toward an unwanted woman and legal necessity for a harried rancher, who had made the whole thing look inevitable. He needed the judge to enforce the marriage requirement, she said mostly to herself, to make sure it was legal and binding and couldn't be contested, and then he stopped socializing with him to create distance. "You think Harrington knew?" Pruitt asked. "I think Harrington may have been used the same way we were," she said. "Or I think he knew exactly what he was doing. I don't know which yet, and until I know, we can't use the county structure to expose any of this because we don't know how far the contamination goes." Pruitt sat down heavily in the chair across from her. He was not a man who showed distress easily, but she could see it in him now, the particular weight of realizing the ground under something you've trusted is not as solid as you thought. "What do we do?" he said. "We find evidence that cannot be altered by anyone in this county," she said. "Something that exists outside Croft's reach. Original documents, correspondence, witnesses who aren't part of this system." She tapped her pen against the desk. "And we do it in the next 6 weeks. That's not a lot of time." "No," she said. "It isn't." The trouble came the next morning, and it came in the form of Silas Croft's wagon pulling up to the front of the ranch house at 9 o'clock, like he had every right in the world to be there. Margaret was the one who answered the door because Jackson was in the far barn, and she was closer. And when she opened it and found Croft standing on the porch, with his hat in his hands and his particular brand of easy practiced warmth on his face, she felt something go very quiet and very sharp in the center of her. "Mrs. Cole," he said with a smile that knew exactly what it was doing. "I wanted to come by and welcome you to the ranch, offer my congratulations in person." "Thank you," she said pleasantly. She didn't move from the doorway. "Is your husband at home?" "He's working," she said. Of course. I won't take much of his time." He looked at her with that smile still in place. "How are you settling in? It can't be an easy adjustment coming from town to all of this." "I'm finding it quite manageable," she said. "I imagine it's a great deal to learn," he said. "Ranch operations, the accounts, all of that. Jackson's always been a one-man operation, hasn't he? Very particular about how things are run." He was watching her face very carefully. She could feel it, the specific pressure of someone probing for a reaction, looking for the edge of what she knew. "He does seem to have a clear system," she said. "I've been spending some time getting familiar with it." "Oh." The smile didn't move. "Have you been looking at the books?" "Just getting oriented," she said. "It's a new household. I like to understand how things work." "Of course you do." He tilted his head slightly. "Find anything interesting?" "Not particularly," she said. "Supply contracts, operational records. It all looks fairly routine." She said it perfectly. Unconcerned, slightly bored, the voice of a woman who had done the minimum amount of looking and found nothing of note. She had learned a long time ago that the best way to hide what you know is to perform a precise, believable version of not knowing it. Croft looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. "Well," he said, "if you have any questions about the legal side of things, the contract requirements, I'm happy to help. I've been managing Jackson's filings for 2 years now. I know the paperwork better than anyone." "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He put his hat back on. "Please do tell your husband I stopped by." "Of course," she said. "Safe ride back." She closed the door and stood in the entrance hall and listened to his wagon move away from the house, and she counted slowly to 15 after the sound faded before she let out the breath she had been controlling for the entirety of that conversation. He knew she'd been in the books. She hadn't confirmed it. She had been careful, perfectly careful, but something in the conversation told her that he'd come to check, not to congratulate. And the fact that he'd come in person, rather than sending a message, told her that he was more concerned than he wanted to appear. She went directly to the window and watched his wagon disappear down the road. Then she went to find Jackson. And she found him at the far barn, exactly where Pruitt had said he'd be working alongside 2 of the hands on something with a fence gate that had been giving trouble. He saw her coming and read her face. She didn't know yet what her face showed him, but something clearly showed because he handed his work off immediately and came toward her. Croft was here, she said when they were out of earshot. Jackson's expression shifted. What did he want? To know how much I know, she said. He wrapped it in a congratulatory visit, but that's what it was. He asked me directly if I'd been looking at the books. What did you tell him? That I'd found everything perfectly routine. She looked at him. He didn't believe me. He was polite enough not to press, but he didn't believe me. Jackson looked toward the road where the wagon had gone. He's moving up his timeline. Yes, she said. We need the original filing documents, the ones from before Croft had access to the county clerk. If anything exists that predates the relationship between him and Alderman, it'll show the discrepancies in what was filed later. She paused. Is there anywhere on this property where you keep originals? Not copies originals with county seals. He thought for a moment. There's a lockbox, in the house under the floorboards in my room. I haven't opened it in over a year. Show me. The lockbox held 4 years of original documentation. Land grants, early contract filings, correspondence from the territorial government deeds. All of it predating Silas Croft by at least 2 years. They spread it across the office desk and went through it together, and what they found when they compared the original filings against the copies on record copies that Croft had theoretically submitted for her was a set of discrepancies so specific and so consistent that they could not have been accidental. 3 clauses in the domestic establishment requirement had been altered in the most recent copy on file. Altered in ways that made the requirement broader, harder to satisfy, more vulnerable to challenge. He rewrote the terms of the contract you were already under, Margaret said quietly, while you were still operating under the assumption of the original terms. Jackson was very still. I never would have known, he said, because I trusted him to handle the paperwork. That was the whole plan, she said. You trusted him. The county clerk confirmed what he filed. And at renewal time, the contract you thought you had, the one you'd built everything around, would have turned out to be something different, something you couldn't satisfy. He looked at the documents for a long moment. And the marriage requirement. She pointed to the relevant clause in the altered version. In the original it says, the holder or a designated representative. In Croft's version, it says, the holder personally and without exception. She looked at him. The original gave you options. The version he filed took them away. He forced the marriage, Jackson said. He made sure you had no other choice, she said. Yes. The room was very quiet. Margaret? He said. And something in the way he said her name, just her name, nothing complicated, made her look up from the documents. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something undefended in it, the look of a man who is seeing fully and clearly for the first time something he should have seen sooner. I'm sorry. For what specifically? She said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. For being one more person who didn't look at you, he said. When you walked into that church, I had already decided who you were. A pause. I was wrong. She held his gaze. Something moved in her chest, not the warm, dissolving feeling of romance novels, nothing so convenient as that. Something more complicated. The specific, difficult feeling of being seen clearly by someone you have been watching carefully for days and have come to respect. You adjusted, she said. That's more than most people manage. It took me 3 days. I've waited 11 years for it from a whole town, she said. 3 days is fast. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost, and she saw it, that flicker at the corner of his mouth, and filed it away, the same way she filed away everything else. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting, and somewhere on the property, one of the hands was calling something to another, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch moved through the walls of the office like a reminder that the world had not paused for any of this, that it was all happening inside the regular, ongoing motion of a working life. What do we do with this? He said, gesturing at the documents. We make copies of everything, she said. Originals stay here in the lockbox back under the floor. We need a lawyer, someone outside this county. Someone Croft doesn't know. Bozeman, Jackson said immediately. There's a firm there. I've used them before Croft came along. Ellison and Gray. Can you get a message to them tomorrow? I can ride there myself if I have to. Not yet, she said. If Croft is watching the ranch, which I think he is, you leaving for Bozeman will tell him something is happening. We need to get the message there without him knowing it was sent. She thought for a moment. Pruitt has family in Bozeman. His sister, Jackson said. Hannah. Does Croft know that? No reason he would. Then Pruitt goes, she said. Family visit, nothing unusual. He carries the documents and the message. The lawyers respond through Hannah. Jackson looked at her. You've done this before, he said. This kind of strategic thinking, under pressure. I've been in situations where I had to be careful, she said simply. You learn to think ahead. She began stacking the documents carefully into order originals, on one side copies being made on the other. Her hands were steady. Her mind was moving fast and clean the way it did when a problem had edges she could work with. She did not notice, because she rarely noticed these things about herself, that Jackson was still watching her, not with the measuring expression of the first days, but with something different now, something that had no useful name yet, but was building in him the way things build that have decided to stay. He noticed it, and he didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. That night at supper, she told him the last piece, the one about Thomas Reed, and how Croft had obtained the information and what it meant about the architecture of the entire scheme. He listened all the way through without speaking. When she finished, he pushed his plate aside and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with that bare, direct gaze that she had come to understand was what it looked like when he was entirely serious. He used your silence against you, Jackson said. The thing you'd done out of decency, he turned it into a weapon. Yes, she said. And the town let him. Because they'd already decided you were expendable, she said. Yes. He sat with that for a moment. Not to everyone, he said quietly. She looked at him. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. She's been on your side the whole time, and Pruitt trusts you more than he's trusted anyone in the 3 years I've known him, and it's been 4 days. He paused. And me. She held his gaze. And you, she said carefully. Whatever else is true about how this started. He said, I'm not him, I'm not Croft, and I'm not the town, and I'm not any of the people who let you carry that alone for 11 years. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, a firmness, a kind of quiet declaration. I want you to know that. She sat very still for a moment. I know that, she said finally, and she meant it. She had known it for days. It was in the records she'd looked through in the operational journals, where he wrote about his workers with a specificity that showed he actually saw them as people in the way Pruitt had talked about him, before she'd gotten there in the 3 days of watching someone closely who didn't know how closely she was watching. Good, he said simply. They finished supper in a silence that was different from any silence they'd had before. Not the silence of two strangers, being careful, not the silence of two people working at cross purposes. The silence of two people who were slowly and without fanfare, and with a great deal still ahead of them, beginning to trust each other. Outside, the Montana night was enormous, and somewhere on a road between here and Willow Creek, Silas Croft was making plans they didn't know about yet. And somewhere in Bozeman, there was a law firm that might be their best chance. And somewhere in the space between what this marriage had been and what it was becoming something, was shifting that neither of them had words for yet, but both of them in their separate quiet ways had already felt. Pruitt left for Bozeman on a Tuesday 3 days after Croft's visit, riding out at first light with the copied documents in a saddlebag and a letter for Ellison and Gray folded inside his coat pocket. He told the hands he was visiting his sister Hannah. He told it naturally, casually, the way a man mentions something that requires no explanation, and Margaret watched from the kitchen window as he rode out and felt the particular anxiety of a plan in motion, the moment when you have committed to something and all you can do is wait to see whether the world cooperates. Jackson came into the kitchen while she was still watching. He poured his coffee and stood beside her and looked out the same window without asking what she was thinking about, because he already knew. He'll make it in 2 days, he said. I know, she said. Ellison is thorough. If anyone can build a legal counter to what Croft has filed, it's him. I know that too, she said. He glanced at her sideways. Then what are you worried about? She turned from the window. That we don't have 2 days before Croft moves, she said. That visit of his, he didn't come out here to congratulate us. He came to assess how much time he had left. And I don't think he decided he had 2 weeks. Jackson was quiet for a moment. What do you think he'll do? I think he'll try to accelerate whatever filing he has planned, she said. If he can get something into the county records before we can counter it, something that officially documents the ranch as non-compliant with the contract terms, then even if Ellison finds the fraud, we're fighting from behind. Can he do that, file something false and have it stick? With aldermen at the clerk's office. Yes, she said. At least long enough to cause serious damage. Jackson set his coffee down. Then we need to move faster than he does. Yes, she said. We do. The problem was that moving faster than Croft meant knowing what he was planning, and they didn't know that, not specifically, not precisely enough to anticipate it. They knew the shape of the scheme, they knew the players, but they didn't know the exact document, the exact timing, the exact mechanism he intended to use for the final move. Margaret had been thinking about this for 2 days. Not openly, not in conversations in the back of her mind running alongside everything else, the way she always carried a problem until it gave up its answer. She thought about it while she cooked. She thought about it while she worked in the kitchen garden, and while she went through the last remaining ledger books, and while she lay awake at night, listening to the ranch settle into darkness around her. And on the 3rd morning after Pruitt left, she woke at 4:30 with the answer fully formed in her mind, the way answers sometimes are when you've been working on them in your sleep. She dressed and went downstairs, and Jackson was already in the office. She was beginning to understand that he barely slept when something was unresolved, that he had a physical intolerance for problems he couldn't work on directly. And she sat down across from him and said, "The witness." He looked up. "What?" "The contract renewal requires documentation," she said. But for a challenge of this magnitude, claiming non-compliance with the domestic establishment requirement, Croft would need more than altered documents. He'd need a witness, someone who could testify that the marriage is not what it appears to be, that the domestic establishment is fraudulent. Jackson was very still. Who would do that? Someone who knew the circumstances of the wedding, she said. Someone who was there, who saw that it was forced, who could argue that a marriage entered into under legal compulsion doesn't satisfy the spirit of the requirement. She looked at him. Who in that church would testify for Croft? He thought for a moment. Croft has relationships with at least a half-dozen men in this county who owe him something. A pause. But for a legal testimony, someone specific, someone credible. Someone who could speak to the nature of the marriage. Judge Harrington arranged the marriage, Margaret said. If he's compromised, if he was part of this from the beginning, he's the most credible witness Croft could produce. He can say he arranged it under duress, that both parties were unwilling, that the contract requirement was technically satisfied, but the spirit of it. He wouldn't, Jackson said. And then after a moment, would he? I don't know, she said honestly. But if Croft goes to Harrington and tells him that things are unraveling, that someone's been looking at the records, the judge has a choice to make. Protect himself by getting ahead of it, or protect himself by finishing what was started. Jackson stood up. He moved the way he moved when his mind was working faster than the room could hold, not pacing exactly, but the particular contained energy of a man who preferred action and was temporarily restricted to thinking. We need to know which way he'll go, Jackson said. Yes, she said. Which means someone needs to talk to Harrington. Yes, she said again. He looked at her. She looked at him. Not me, he said. He'll read it as confrontation. He'll close up immediately. Not me either, she said. I have no standing with him and he knows it. She paused. But there's someone who does. Mrs. Whitmore had been the most respected woman in Willow Creek for 30 years. She had been there longer than the current courthouse, longer than most of the families who considered themselves permanent. She had extended credit to half the town during bad years and never collected on more than she needed to, which was the kind of thing that built a certain quiet authority that official positions rarely produced. She was also, as Margaret had observed over 11 years of close proximity, a woman who knew exactly how to have a conversation that appeared to be one thing while being entirely another. Margaret rode into town alone on Wednesday morning. Jackson had offered again to come. She had declined again for the same reason. She needed to appear to be a woman making ordinary social calls, not a woman with a husband conducting reconnaissance. She tied her horse in front of Whitmore's and went in through the front door this time, and Mrs. Whitmore looked at her face and said immediately to her assistant, "Eleanor, take your lunch early today." And the young woman was gone within 2 minutes. "What do you need?" Mrs. Whitmore said. "I need you to have a conversation with Judge Harrington," Margaret said. "Casually, at the post office or at church somewhere public and unremarkable. I need you to mention, as if you've simply noticed it in passing, that the Cole Ranch seems to be doing extremely well, that the marriage appears to be a genuine success, that you understand the domestic establishment requirement has been met so thoroughly that several people in town have commented on it." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes were sharp and very bright. "You want him to know the arrangement is solid." "I want him to know before Croft gets to him that undermining it would be undermining something real." Margaret kept her voice level. "If Harrington believes the marriage is only a legal convenience, only a piece of paper, then helping Croft challenge it is low risk. If he believes it's something more substantial, the calculus changes." "And is it?" Mrs. Whitmore said. "Something more substantial." Margaret held the older woman's gaze without flinching. "It is becoming something," she said carefully. "Yes." Mrs. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has seen a great deal of life and recognizes things that are true before they're fully formed. "I'll speak to him today," she said. "Thank you," Margaret had said. She stood to go, then stopped. "One more thing. If Croft has approached Harrington, if there's any sign of that, I need to know as soon as possible." "I'll find out," Mrs. Whitmore said simply. "I've known Henry Harrington for 20 years. I'll know within 5 minutes of speaking to him whether Croft has been there." She was riding back to the ranch when she saw the wagon. It was pulled off to the side of the road, about a mile out of town, and at first she thought it was a broken wheel or a thrown shoe, the ordinary misfortunes of road travel. But as she drew closer, she recognized the horse, a bay with a distinctive white marking on its left shoulder. And then she recognized the man standing beside the wagon, with his arms crossed, and his hat tilted back, and his expression arranged into its practiced easiness. Silas Croft. He had positioned himself on the only road between town and the Cole Ranch. There was no interpretation of that which was accidental. She kept riding. She did not slow down. She had learned a long time ago that slowing down in response to someone who wanted you to slow down was a concession you paid for later. "Mrs. Cole," he called when she was close enough. She stopped the horse, because stopping was different from stopping was a choice, not a response. She looked at him from the saddle with the expression she reserved for people who required her to be careful, not hostile, not warm, simply clear. "Mr. Croft," she said. "Wagon trouble." "No, no." He came toward her with that easy walk, that hat slightly tilted. "I was hoping I might run into you, actually. Convenient timing." "Quite," she said. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation the other day," he said. "About the ranch accounts. I've been thinking, as the legal representative, I really should sit down with you and go through the filing history. Make sure everything is clear for the contract renewal." He paused, looking up at her, with his eyes very steady under the easy smile. "I'd hate for there to be any confusion about the documentation." "That's thoughtful," she said. "Though I'm not sure that's necessary. Everything seems quite clear from where I'm sitting." "Does it?" The smile stayed in place. "I'd feel better knowing we were all working from the same understanding. Sometimes these records can be confusing, especially to someone who isn't familiar with the specific legal language. "I've always found legal language fairly manageable," she said pleasantly. "I spent some time with it a few years ago. Contractual terms, filing procedures. The ways that documents can appear to say one thing while technically meaning another." She kept her voice entirely conversational. Fascinating area. Something moved in his eyes. Just for a moment, a flash of something that wasn't quite as easy as his expression. "Well," he said, "the offer stands, any time. I'll mention it to my husband," she said. "Good day, Mr. Croft." She set the horse moving again without waiting for his response. She didn't look back, but she felt his eyes on her until she'd gone far enough around a bend in the road that the sight line broke and she let out her breath slowly and steadily and thought, "He's scared. He's not moving up his timeline. He's already moved it." Jackson was in the yard when she rode back in, and he read her face before she had dismounted. What happened? She told him about Croft on the road. She told it fast and cleanly, the way she'd trained herself to deliver information, facts, first interpretation, second emotion, not at all until it was useful. When she finished, Jackson's jaw was tight. "He's following you. Or he guessed I'd go into town and positioned himself to intercept me on the way back," she said. "Either way, he knows more than we thought." "Did he say anything useful?" "He wanted to go over the documentation with me," she said. "Which means he wants to know exactly what I've found and whether I can prove any of it." She tied off the horse and turned to face him directly. "He's scared, Jackson. The easy manner is a performance. Underneath it, he's calculating very fast." Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then, "Pruitt's been gone 4 days. He should reach Ellison today." "If everything went smoothly," she said. "It went smoothly," he said, with the particular certainty of a man who has trusted someone for 3 years and knows the measure of them. "Pruitt doesn't stumble." She nodded. "Then we have a few days. Maybe less." She looked at him. "There's something else I need to tell you. Something I realized this morning that I've been working through. Tell me." "The altered contract clauses," she said. "The ones that change the domestic establishment requirement. Croft wrote them to be broader, harder to satisfy. But the marriage, our marriage, was his idea. He engineered it." She paused. "Which means he must have believed when he arranged it that a forced marriage between an unwilling rancher and an unwanted woman would be easy to challenge on the same grounds he created." Jackson's eyes sharpened. "He planned to challenge it himself." "I think so," she said. "He creates the requirement. He makes sure you can't meet it any other way. You marry the one woman the town selected because she has no standing to defend herself. And then, at the right moment, with the right documentation and a willing witness, he challenges the marriage as fraudulent, as a legal convenience that doesn't satisfy the contract's actual terms." "Which he wrote," Jackson said slowly. "Which he wrote," she confirmed. "The whole thing is a loop. He built both sides of it." The silence that followed had weight and texture. "He never expected us to actually work," Jackson said. Not quite to himself. More like a man turning over a fact that he is only beginning to understand has several layers. "No," she said. "He expected us to be miserable and separate and easy to dismantle." She looked at him steadily. Two strangers forced together under humiliating circumstances don't usually sit in an office at midnight discovering land fraud together. "No," he said. "They don't." And there it was again, that thing that crossed his face that she had no name for yet, that looked like the beginning of something that was going to be important. "Show." Mrs. Whitmore sent a message that evening through Eleanor, the shop assistant, who brought it out to the ranch on the pretext of delivering a sewing order that Margaret hadn't placed. The message was short-written in the older woman's careful hand on a folded piece of paper tucked inside the brown paper package. Margaret read it in the kitchen, and then read it again. Then she went to find Jackson. He was in the barn finishing the end of the day's work alongside his hands, and she waited until the others had moved off before she came to him and handed him the paper. He read it. His expression didn't move at first. Then something in it went very cold. "Croft met with Harrington 2 days ago," he said. Yes, she said. Before our conversation with Mrs. Whitmore. Before my conversation with Croft on the road. He'd already been to the judge. And Harrington? According to Mrs. Whitmore, he was very uncomfortable when she raised the subject of the marriage, she said. Uncomfortable in the specific way a man is uncomfortable when he has done something he knows he shouldn't have. She folded the paper. He didn't confess anything, but she says he looked guilty in a way she hasn't seen from him before, and she's known him a long time. Jackson handed her back the paper. His hands were very steady, which she had come to understand was what it looked like when he was very angry. The stillness was the control, not the absence of the feeling. So Harrington is involved, he said. I believe so, she said, though I think he may be in over his head. His discomfort suggests a man who agreed to something and is beginning to understand what he actually agreed to. She paused. That might be useful. Or it might mean he has more reason to see this through, Jackson said. To protect himself. Yes, she said. Both are true. They looked at each other in the fading light of the barn. If Harrington testifies for Croft, Jackson said quietly, that changes the legal picture significantly. A sitting judge saying the marriage was fraudulent. It changes it, she agreed. It doesn't end it. The original documents Pruitt carried to Ellison, those exist outside of Harrington's reach. The fraud can still be proven. She kept her voice steady, precise. But it complicates everything. The timeline gets harder. The legal battle gets longer. And during a long legal battle, I could lose the ranch, he said. You could lose the ranch, she said. The words sat between them. Jackson turned away briefly, one hand on the barn wall, and she watched him absorb it, the full weight of what they were facing. The specific kind of heaviness that comes when a situation you'd been managing at a reasonable distance suddenly arrives directly in front of you. Then he turned back. What do we need to do? He said. It came out level, focused. She understood then that this was how he was in a crisis, not collapsed, not panicked, but narrowed down to the essential question. What do we do next? We need to get to Harrington before Croft does again, she said. Not to threaten him, not to accuse him, but to give him a choice that's better than the one Croft offered him. What kind of choice? The truth, she said simply. What Croft has been doing laid out plainly with documentation. If Harrington understands the full scope, if he sees that Croft's plan involves him committing perjury to cover land fraud, he may decide that the risk isn't worth it. She paused. Or he may not. But it's the only move we have that goes through him rather than around him. And if it goes around him, then Ellison files the challenge in federal court above the county level, and Harrington's testimony becomes one voice among many instead of the deciding factor, she said. That's the slower path, but it exists. Jackson nodded once definitively, the way he did when he'd processed something and committed to it. When do we go to Harrington? Tomorrow, she said. Early, before Croft can get to him first. They rode to town at 7 the next morning, and Margaret had not slept much, and Jackson looked like he hadn't slept at all, and neither of them commented on either of these things, because there was nothing useful to say about them. Judge Harrington's office was in the courthouse on the main street of Willow Creek, and they tied up in front of it and went in through the front door, like two people with every right to be there, which they were. The clerk at the front desk looked up when they came in and went very still for a moment, the specific stillness of someone recognizing a situation they weren't expecting. We'd like to see Judge Harrington, Jackson said. It's about the contract renewal. He'll know what that means. The clerk disappeared. Margaret and Jackson stood in the entrance hall and waited, and she could feel the building around them, the weight of its official function. The documents filed here, the decisions made in the back rooms, all of it, part of the structure that Croft had been quietly manipulating for over a year. The clerk came back. He'll see you. Yeah. Judge Harrington was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the kind of face that had once been authoritative, and was now something more complicated, the face of a man who had made too many compromises and carried them visibly in the way he held his jaw and the set of his eyes. He looked at them when they came in with an expression that was trying for composed and landing somewhere just short of it. "Jackson," he said, "and Mrs. Cole." He gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "Please." They sat. Margaret put the folder of copied documents on the desk in front of her and left her hand on it without opening it, and she saw Harrington's eyes go to the folder and stay there for just a fraction of a second too long. "Judge," Jackson said, "we want to have a plain conversation, without lawyers, without official language, just the three of us." "Of course," Harrington said carefully. "You know what Silas Croft has been doing," Jackson said. "Or you know some of it. I want to show you the rest." The silence that followed was the kind that a man feels only when he's decided which way he's going to fall. Harrington looked at the folder, then at Jackson, then for the first time directly at Margaret. Something in his expression shifted a recognition, or the beginning of one. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "may I ask how much have you found?" "Enough," she said. "The altered contract clauses, the feed contract manipulation, the correspondence between Croft and Alderman at the clerk's office." She opened the folder and laid the first document on the desk, a copy of the original filing, beside a copy of the altered version, the discrepancies circled in her small, neat hand. "These are copies. The originals are with Ellison and Gray and Bozeman." Harrington looked at the documents. The color in his face changed slightly. "He told me it was a straightforward business arrangement," Harrington said slowly. "That Jackson wasn't managing the ranch effectively. That the contract would eventually go to someone better positioned to—" He stopped himself. "I should have asked more questions." "Yes," Jackson said. "Flat. Direct. Not forgiving, not attacking. Just factual." "He said the marriage was the cleanest solution," Harrington said. "That there were eligible women in the county who might benefit from the arrangement, and that the requirement would be satisfied legally, and that—" He stopped again. He looked at Margaret, and in his expression there was something that was close to shame. "He recommended you specifically, Mrs. Cole. He said you were that the town considered you." "I know what the town considers me," Margaret said quietly. "I've known for 11 years. And I know that he chose me because he expected me to be easy to use and impossible to believe." The words landed quietly in the room. Harrington put both hands flat on his desk and looked at them. He was a man in his 60s who had spent 30 years building something, a reputation, a position, a community standing, and he was looking at the edge of it now, the place where one decision had led to another, and the ground had run out. "What do you need from me?" he said. His voice was quieter than it had been. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "We need you to not testify for him," she said. "We need you to not provide any statement, official or otherwise, that the marriage or the domestic establishment is fraudulent. And we need you to preserve the documentation you have from any conversations with Croft, whatever he told you, whatever you were shown." "And in return," Harrington said. "In return," Jackson said, "we give you the chance to be on the right side of this before it goes to federal court. Because it is going to federal court. That decision was made before we walked in here." Harrington was very still. "He'll know," the judge said. "If I don't do what he's expecting, he'll know immediately." "Yes," Margaret said. "He will. He has leverage," Harrington said. "There are other decisions I made early on when I thought he was simply a competent attorney doing legitimate work. There are approvals I signed that look worse now that you know what he was actually building," she said. "Yes, Judge Harrington," she said, and she kept her voice steady and direct, the way she kept it steady through everything, because in her experience, the only way to speak to a man who was deciding whether to be decent was to speak to the decent part of him like it was already in charge. Every person in this county who has made a mistake while trusting Silas Croft is in the same position you're in right now. The question is not whether you made an error. The question is what you do from this moment forward." The room was quiet. Outside, Willow Creek was doing what it always did. The ordinary ongoing business of a small town oblivious to the conversation happening in the room where its judge was being given a chance to choose. Harrington looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at Jackson. Then he looked at Margaret. "Give me until tomorrow morning," he said. They rode back to the ranch, and neither of them spoke much, and it was a different silence again, the silence of two people who have put something important in motion and can't do anything now but wait to see if it holds. At the ranch, the hands were in the middle of the afternoon work, and the ordinary sounds of the property wrapped around them as they rode in, and Margaret thought about how quickly something can come to feel like home. Not a grand realization, but a small practical one. The way the barn smelled, the angle of the afternoon light through the kitchen window, the sound of the creek somewhere beyond the south pasture. She had not expected to feel this. She had not expected most of what the past 2 weeks had produced in her. Jackson unsaddled the horses and she went to the kitchen, and she was standing at the counter with a cup of tea going cold in her hands when he came in and stopped in the doorway and looked at her in the particular way she was beginning to recognize, not the measuring look of the first days, but something more settled, more certain of what it was looking at. "You were remarkable in there," he said. "I just spoke plainly," she said. "That's what I mean," he said. "Most people can't do that when it matters. They get complicated, they get emotional or strategic, or they lose the thread of what they're actually trying to say." He came to the counter and stood near her, not touching, near. "You never lost the thread." She looked down at her tea. "I had to learn not to," she said. "When you spend a long time as the person no one takes seriously, you learn to be very precise. Every word matters. You can't afford the ones that give people an excuse not to listen." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been doing that your whole adult life," he said. "Being precise, being careful, making yourself impossible to dismiss." "Yes," she said. "And then Croft chose you because he thought you were already dismissed," he said. "The great irony," she said. "No," he said quietly. "The great miscalculation." He paused. "I've been thinking about what you said, that he never expected us to work, that he built this whole plan on the assumption that we'd be a disaster." "Yes," she said. "I've been thinking about that because—" He stopped. She waited. She had learned the rhythm of him now, the way he started a sentence and then stopped when he was saying something he hadn't practiced, something that was coming out less organized than he preferred. "Because it means he looked at you and decided you were worthless. And he looked at me and decided I was manageable. And both of those things were wrong. And the fact that they were wrong is the reason any of this—" Another stop. A breath. "Is the reason we're standing here instead of where he planned for us to be." She looked up from her tea. He was looking at her with something on his face that was no longer the beginning of something. It was the thing itself, arrived fully formed, recognizable to both of them, even if neither had named it yet. She had not planned for this. She had planned for survival, for evidence, for legal recourse. She had not made room in any of her plans for the specific feeling of being seen by someone who had started with nothing about her and built his understanding of her from scratch, day by day, through her own actions in real time. It was different from anything that had come before. It was different in ways she didn't have words for. "Jackson," she said. "I know," he said. He said it quietly, without pressure, without asking her to do anything with it. Just acknowledging it. Setting it down between them gently, the way you set down something valuable on an unsteady surface. She nodded once. Something in her chest moved, not broke, not dissolved, but shifted. Rearranged into a configuration she hadn't stood in before. "One thing at a time," she said. "One thing at a time," he agreed. But the thing was there. It had been building since the second day, maybe since the first, since the church, since she had walked down an aisle full of people waiting to see her fail, and had smiled at a man who hadn't asked for her, and he had blinked that unguarded blink of a man encountering something he didn't have a category for. Pruitt came back from Bozeman the following morning. He looked tired and rode in fast, and Margaret was in the yard when he came through the gate, and she knew before he spoke. that something had changed, because his face had the look of a man carrying news he hadn't been able to put down since he learned it. Ellison read the documents, he said, getting down from his horse with the stiffness of someone who had pushed the pace hard. He says it's enough. He says the fraud is clear in the original filings and he can build the federal challenge. He caught his breath. But there's something else. Tell me, she said. He knows Croft, Pruitt said. Or he knew him. 20 years ago, before Croft came to Willow Creek, he was practicing law in Helena under a different name. He looked at her steadily. He did this before. The same scheme: land contracts, altered filings, a network in the county records office. He was caught. He was disbarred. A pause. Under the name Silas Crawford. The name hit her like cold water. Silas Crawford. Disbarred in Helena under a land fraud conviction. And now, 20 years later, Silas Croft in Willow Creek doing the same thing to a different rancher. He's not just corrupt, she said. He's a convicted fraudster practicing law illegally. Yes, Pruitt said. She stood with that for a moment. Then Ellison has this documented, the disbarment, the conviction. He's pulling the records today, Pruitt said. He says he can have everything filed in federal court within the week. Margaret turned toward the house. I need to tell Jackson, she said. And then we need to decide whether to wait for Harrington's answer or move now. There's one more thing, Pruitt said, and she stopped. She looked back at him. Croft filed something yesterday, he said, with aldermen. Ellison's contact at the federal land office sent word. He doesn't know exactly what it was, but something went in. The air seemed to shift. Yesterday, she said. While you were at the courthouse talking to Harrington, Pruitt said. He filed while your backs were turned. She looked at Pruitt for one long, steady moment. Then she went inside to find Jackson, and her mind was moving fast and clean, and absolutely certain, and she thought he made his move. He thought he had more time than he had. And he was wrong about that the way he had been wrong about everything else. The difference was that now they had his history, his real name, his prior conviction. And Ellison and Bozeman building a federal case that Silas Croft or Silas Crawford or whatever name he had used before this one had never been meant to face. She found Jackson in the office, and she told him everything, and she watched his face move through surprise, and then something that was not quite anger and not quite relief, but a compressed mixture of both, the look of a man who has been fighting in the dark for 2 weeks and has just found the light switch. He filed yesterday, Jackson said. Yes. While we were talking to Harrington? Yes. He looked at her. He thought if he got something into the record while we were occupied. He was trying to get ahead of us, she said, the way he has been getting ahead of everyone for 20 years. She paused. But this time, someone was paying attention. Jackson stood up. We need to move tonight, he said. Not tomorrow, tonight. I'm going to write to Ellison directly. I'll have one of the hands write it to Bozeman by first light. And Harrington, she said. Harrington's answer comes in the morning, he said. If it's yes, we use him. If it's no, we go around him. His jaw was tight. Either way, Silas Croft filed something with a forged identity, and 20 years of prior fraud behind him, and by the end of this week, the federal land office is going to know everything about both. She stood up too. They faced each other across the office, where they had spent the last 2 weeks building a case out of the raw materials of a scheme designed to destroy them both. We're going to win this, he said. Not a question, not bravado, just a man who had looked at the available evidence and reached the only reasonable conclusion. Yes, she said. We are. And in the lamplight of the office, with the documents spread between them and the whole weight of what they'd built together in 2 weeks present in the room, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The specific, grounded confidence of a person who is no longer fighting alone. It was the best feeling she had known in 11 years. And outside, the Montana night was enormous and dark, And somewhere in Willow Creek, Silas Croft did not yet know that the woman he had chosen for her silence had turned out to be the most dangerous thing he had ever underestimated. Harrington's answer came at dawn. Not in a message, not through Eleanor or any other intermediary. The judge himself rode out to the ranch in the early morning gray, alone without his clerk, without the formal trappings of his office. Just a heavy-set man in his 60s, on a tired horse arriving at the gate of the coal ranch, like a man who had made a decision sometime in the night and wanted to deliver it before he changed his mind. Margaret was the one who saw him coming. She had been up since 5, the way she was up every morning now. Not from anxiety exactly, though anxiety was present, but from the particular alertness of someone whose mind had decided that sleep was a secondary concern until this was finished. She was standing at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee when she saw the shape of horse and rider coming down the road. And she knew who it was before she could see his face clearly. She set her cup down and went to wake Jackson. He was already awake. He answered her knock immediately, fully dressed, which told her he had not slept either, and they went to the front of the house together and opened the door as Harrington was tying his horse at the post. The three of them looked at each other in the early light. "Come in," Jackson said. Harrington came in. He sat in the kitchen, not the office, Margaret noticed, not the room with the documents, and he held his hat in his hands and looked at the table for a moment before he spoke. "I've been a judge in this county for 18 years, he said. "I've made decisions I'm proud of and decisions that I'm not. Last night I sat with all of them." He looked up at Jackson. "I'm not proud of what I agreed to with Croft. I want to be clear about that. I was told a version of things that was incomplete, and I didn't ask the questions I should have asked because the answers he was giving me were convenient." "What did he tell you?" Margaret said. "He told me the ranch was going to default on the contract, regardless that Jackson had been mismanaging the operation for 2 years and the federal review would catch it. He said the marriage requirement was a formality that could be satisfied on paper, but that wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, and that he needed me to be prepared to confirm, if asked, that the arrangement was legal but not substantive." Harrington's jaw tightened. He used very careful language. He made it sound like I'd simply be confirming a fact, not providing false testimony. "But you knew it wasn't just confirming a fact," Jackson said. "I knew," Harrington said quietly. "I let myself not know it clearly enough to say no." He set his hat on the table. "What you showed me yesterday, the documents, the altered clauses, I went through my own records last night. I found 3 filings that Croft submitted for my signature that I now believe were not what he represented them to be." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Do you still have those filings?" "Yes," he said. "I brought copies." He reached into his coat and placed a folded envelope on the table. "These are the originals from my personal files, not the county copies, my copies. Croft doesn't know I keep duplicates of everything I sign." Margaret picked up the envelope. She opened it carefully and looked at the first page, and what she saw made something in her chest go very still and very focused. "This is a pre-authorization," she said, "for a county reassessment of the Eastern Grazing Territory." She looked up at Harrington. "This is dated 4 months ago." "Yes," he said. "Croft had you sign a reassessment authorization 4 months before the contract renewal," she said, "which means the moment the contract lapses or is challenged, the reassessment is already in place. The land doesn't go to open contest. It goes directly to whoever filed the reassessment claim, which would be," Jackson said slowly, "filed under the Willow Creek Land Development Association," Harrington said, "which as of 3 months ago has 1 registered member." "Croft," Margaret said. "Croft." Harrington confirmed. The room was very quiet. This was the final piece. Not just fraud, not just altered contracts. A complete premeditated system designed to transfer the Eastern Grazing Territory directly into Croft's control the moment Jackson Cole lost his claim. The marriage had been the trigger. The reassessment authorization was the mechanism. Everything else had been noise designed to keep anyone from seeing the mechanism clearly. "He's been planning this for longer than 18 months, Margaret said. "I think so," Harrington said. I think the feed contract manipulation, the things Pruitt told me about when I called him this morning, those started 2 years ago. The authorization I signed was the end point, not the beginning. Jackson was very still beside her. She could feel the controlled anger in him, the way you feel heat from something that isn't touching you, the specific temperature of a man who has understood fully and finally the complete scope of what was done to him. He used my ranch as a long game, Jackson said. 2 years. Yes, Harrington said. And he used Margaret as the final insurance, Jackson said. If I married someone with credibility, someone the town respected, she might have noticed something and been believed. He needed someone they'd dismiss. He said it without looking at her. But she heard the weight in it, the anger on her behalf that she had heard once before the second day when she'd told him about Thomas Reed. It was the same quality, the same barely controlled edge. "What do you need from me?" Harrington said. It was the second time he'd asked that question in 2 days, and the second time it came from a different place than the first, not political calculation, but something closer to actual accountability. "Everything you just gave us," Margaret said, "plus a written statement, dated, signed, witnessed, describing what Croft told you, what he asked you to do, and what you found in your own records." She paused. "Not for the county court, for the federal filing in Bozeman." "I'll write it today," Harrington said. "And Mrs. Cole." He looked at her directly. "I owe you an apology that I don't have adequate words for. I was part of what was done to you, even if I didn't fully understand it. I signed documents that arranged your life without your genuine consent, and I told myself it was the charitable thing." His voice was heavy. "It wasn't charitable. It was convenient, and I'm sorry." Margaret held his gaze for a moment. She did not immediately say it was all right, because it wasn't all right, and she had spent too long accepting less than she was owed to perform forgiveness she didn't feel yet. "Write the statement," she said. "That's the beginning of making it right." He nodded. He picked up his hat. He left. Good. The letter to Ellison went out with a rider at 6 that morning, Jackson's fastest hand on his fastest horse, carrying the Harrington documents, and a letter detailing everything: the reassessment authorization, the Land Development Association, the prior conviction under the name Crawford, all of it assembled by Margaret at the desk in the office in 2 hours of work that left her hand aching and her mind perfectly clear. By the time the rider was out of sight, she and Jackson were already thinking about the next problem. "He filed something with Alderman yesterday," Jackson said, "while we were at the courthouse." "Yes," she said. "We don't know what it was. We need to know." "Yes," she said again. "But we can't go to the county clerk's office directly. If Alderman is compromised and we walk in asking about Croft's filing, he'll alert Croft immediately." "Then who goes?" She thought for a moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "She has a standing account with the county recorder's office. She files property tax documentation every quarter. She has legitimate business there. If she asks to review a recent filing as part of her records verification, she can see what Croft submitted without it looking like anything unusual," Jackson said. "Exactly." He was already reaching for his coat. "I'll ride in and ask her." "Wait," she said. He stopped. "Send one of the hands. You riding into town again after yesterday will draw attention. We've been visible enough. Every time either of us appears in Willow Creek right now, Croft learns something." He looked at her for a moment. Then he hung the coat back up. "You're right," he said. It came out simply without resistance, the way he said things when he'd thought about them for half a second and found them correct. She had noticed early on that he didn't have the kind of pride that required him to pretend he'd thought of something first. It was one of the things she respected most about him. She sent young Carson, the youngest of the hands who had a sister who worked at the milliner's 2 doors from the courthouse, and had every natural reason to be in that part of town on a weekday morning. And then she waited, which was the hardest part of all of it. She went back to the kitchen garden because waiting was easier when her hands were occupied, and she was on her knees in the 3rd row when Jackson came and sat on the fence rail nearby and watched her work without offering to help, which she also appreciated, It was the kind of quiet company that didn't require anything from either of them. "Can I ask you something?" he said after a while. "Yes," she said without looking up. "When you walked down that aisle," he said, "when you smiled, was any part of you not performing, not armor?" She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was looking at her with the direct, steady gaze that she had come to understand was what he looked like when he was asking the truest version of a question. She thought about it honestly the way she tried to think about everything honestly. "There was a moment," she said, "when I walked through the door and felt the air in the church, all of those people, all of that anticipation, and I realized that they were all waiting for me to look small." She paused. "And something in me just refused. Not as a decision exactly, more like a reflex. The smile came from that refusal." She looked at him. So it was armor. But it was also real. Both things were true at the same time. He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that moment since the wedding," he said. "I didn't know you. I'd decided who you were before you walked in. And then you walked in and you smiled like that, and everything I'd decided, it just didn't hold anymore." She looked at him for a long moment. "What had you decided?" "That you'd be fragile," he said. "Or bitter. That you'd be someone I'd have to manage carefully. Someone I'd have to protect from the situation." A pause. "Instead, you walked in and started protecting me from it before I'd even figured out what was happening." She turned back to the garden, but she was smiling slightly, not the armor smile, something quieter and more private. "You didn't need protection," she said. "You needed a second set of eyes." "Same thing," he said. She looked up at him again. He was almost smiling too. Almost. The moment held warm and specific and real, and neither of them did anything with it, and neither of them needed to. Carson came back at noon. He came in fast, which told her something before he spoke, and he found her and Jackson together in the office, and delivered his report with the serious concentration of a young man who understood that what he was carrying mattered. "Mrs. Whitmore got into the recent filings," he said. "She said to tell you." He pulled a folded note from his pocket. She wrote it down because she didn't want to get it wrong. Margaret took the note and read it. Then she read it again. Then she handed it to Jackson without speaking. He read it. His face went through several things very quickly. "He filed a declaration of abandonment," Jackson said. "Yes," she said. He claimed I abandoned the domestic establishment requirement. That the marriage was..." He stopped. "He claimed you left. That I left the ranch and returned to town," she said. "That the marriage was non-operational. That the domestic establishment was therefore void." She looked at him steadily. "He filed it yesterday while we were at the courthouse because he knew we were both away from the property." "But you didn't leave," Jackson said. "You rode into town and came back." "Yes," she said. "But Alderman accepted the filing, which means it's in the record now. A declaration of abandonment dated yesterday claiming the contract requirement is unmet." She paused. "It's false, but it's in the county record." Jackson put the note down. "Can Ellison counter it?" "At the federal level, yes," she said. "The false filing is actually useful to us. It's evidence of the fraud in real time, not just historically. A fraudster filing a false document while a federal investigation is being assembled is..." She paused. "It's significantly worse for him than anything we found in the old records." "So he's made it worse for himself," Jackson said. "Considerably," she said. "He thought he was getting ahead of us. Instead, he handed Ellison a live example to add to the federal case." Jackson sat back, and then slowly something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the particular quality of a man who has been under sustained pressure for 2 weeks and has just seen clearly and undeniably that the pressure is about to go the other direction. "He's going to lose," Jackson said. "Not triumphant, just certain. He's going to lose," she agreed. What none of them anticipated was that Croft would move before the week was out. Not in the courts. Not through Alderman or Harrington or any of the legal mechanisms he had built over 2 years. He moved the way cornered men sometimes move when their careful, constructed plans begin to collapse suddenly directly, and with a complete abandonment of the patience that had made him dangerous. He came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon with 2 men. Margaret didn't recognize, not from Willow Creek, hired men from somewhere else, the kind of men who came with a certain look about them, and didn't make eye contact when they got out of the wagon. Jackson was in the far field when they arrived. Margaret was in the house. She heard the wagon and went to the front window and looked out, and when she saw who it was and who he had brought with him, she felt something go very cold and very alert in the center of her. Not fear, but the heightened clarity that comes just before something happens that you've been moving toward for a long time. She went to the door and opened it before he could knock. Croft looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, the easy manner was entirely absent. What was underneath it was harder and less pleasant, and considerably more honest. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "I need to speak with your husband." "He's working," she said. "Send for him." She looked at the 2 men behind him. They were standing with the particular stillness of men who had been told to stand still and wait, which meant they had been told something would happen after the waiting. "I'll ask you to wait outside," she said. "I'll get Jackson." "I'd rather come in," he said. "I'd rather you didn't," she said pleasantly. His jaw shifted. He stepped forward anyway. She did not move from the doorway. They looked at each other for one long specific moment. 2 people who had been in a game of careful indirection for 2 weeks, and now the indirection was over, and what was left was just the 2 of them and the space between them and the question of who was going to give ground. She didn't give ground. "Mr. Croft," she said, and her voice was completely level, completely clear, carrying exactly as far as it needed to. "I have a copy of a document from the Helena Bar Association dated 22 years ago. I have a federal filing submitted by the law firm of Ellison and Gray in Bozeman referencing a prior conviction under the name Silas Crawford, and I have a signed statement from Judge Henry Harrington describing in specific detail every conversation he has had with you in the past 6 months." She looked at him steadily. "You are not coming into this house, and you are going to want to think very carefully about the next thing you do, because whatever you came here to accomplish today will not go the way you planned." The silence that followed was the longest she had stood in for a very long time. One of the men behind Croft shifted his weight. Just slightly. Croft looked at her, and she watched something happen in his face, the process of a man realizing in real time that his intelligence about the situation was wrong. That the woman he had selected for her silence and her disposability had been for the past 2 weeks methodically and precisely dismantling everything he had spent 2 years constructing. "The Crawford matter was resolved," he said. His voice was careful now, the way a man is careful when he is buying time to think. "The disbarment stands," she said, "which means everything you have filed in this county as an attorney at law is filed fraudulently. Every document, every contract, every clause you wrote, and every filing you submitted." She paused. "Including the declaration of abandonment from yesterday." His eyes went very still. "The federal filing names you specifically," she said. "Under both names. It was submitted 3 days ago. By now, the Federal Land Office has received it." She kept her gaze on his face. "You came here today to do something that would set back our position. You're too late." Behind him, one of the hired men took a step back toward the wagon. Just 1 step. But Croft heard it, and she watched him hear it, and she watched the last of whatever plan he had come with dissolve. He looked at her for one more moment. Something moved in his expression. Not respect, nothing as clean as that, but the specific acknowledgement of a man who has lost a contest he didn't believe he could lose. "This isn't finished," he said. "It will be," she said. "Soon." He turned. He walked back to the wagon. The 2 men were already climbing up. He got in and took the reins, and she stood in the doorway of the ranch house and watched him drive away. And she stayed there until he was completely out of sight. Then her legs went slightly unsteady, the delayed response of a body that had held itself rigid through something it found alarming, and she put one hand on the doorframe and breathed. "Margaret." She turned. Jackson was coming across the yard at a near run. Someone had gone to get him. She realized one of the hands had seen the wagon and gone for him. He took in her face and the empty road and the hand on the doorframe in one fast sweep. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She meant it. The unsteadiness was passing. "He's gone." "What happened?" She told him. All of it quickly in the clear factual sequence she used for important information. When she got to the part where she had told Croft what they had, the Crawford records, the Harrington statement, the federal filing, Jackson's expression went very still. "You told him everything we have," he said. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because the only thing left that could have hurt us was the thing we didn't know he was planning," she said. "If he came here with a plan, the plan depended on us not knowing what he knew. Once I told him what we had, the plan was useless." She looked at him. A cornered man with a plan is dangerous. A cornered man who knows his plan won't work is just cornered. Jackson looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You were standing in that doorway alone when he had 2 men with him." "Yes," she said. "That was—" He stopped. "You should have waited for me." "There wasn't time," she said. "And I wasn't in danger. He's a man who uses systems and documents and patience. He's not a man who does things directly. That's why he brought hired men. They were for show." She paused. "He's never done anything with his own hands in his life. He wouldn't start now." Jackson looked at her with that expression again, the one that was no longer the beginning of something, the one that was the thing itself. "You were not afraid," he said. "I didn't say that," she said quietly. "I said I wasn't in danger. Those aren't the same thing." He stepped toward her, and she was still in the doorway, with the afternoon light behind her, and he stopped close enough that she could see the texture of the concern in his face. Real concern, the kind that didn't perform itself. "You don't have to do everything alone," he said. "Not anymore." She looked up at him. "I know," she said. And it came out softer than she intended. Not fragile, but genuine, the specific softness of someone saying a true thing they haven't said often enough. "Good," he said. Same word as before, same delivery. But it meant something different now than it had 2 weeks ago. Everything meant something different now than it had 2 weeks ago. The harvest gathering in Willow Creek was 3 days later. It was an annual event. The end of the season, the whole county coming together. Tables set up in the town square, food and music, and the particular collective relief of a community that had made it through another year. Margaret had attended it every year for 11 years. Usually alone, usually positioned at the edges doing what she did, observing, enduring, smiling when it was useful. She almost didn't go this year. She had reasons not to. The federal case was in motion. Croft was somewhere in the county, making whatever last moves he was going to make, and there was real work still to be done at the ranch that kept both her and Jackson occupied from first light to last. But Jackson said on the morning of the gathering, "We should go." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "Why?" "Because this county is watching us," he said. "Because what Croft filed, the abandonment declaration, is in the county record right now, and people know it or will know it soon. And the best counter to a false document isn't always another document." He paused. "Sometimes it's just showing up." She thought about that. "You're right," she said. "I know," he said, and this time he did almost smile, the way he was beginning to do more often, that slight shift at the corner of his mouth that she had catalogued from the very first day. They went to the harvest gathering. They arrived together, which was in itself a statement. The town noticed. The town always noticed, which was one of the things about small places that was both its worst quality and its most useful one. Margaret wore the best dress she owned, which was not exceptional, but was well maintained, and she walked beside Jackson with the same chin-level posture she had always used, and looked at whoever looked at her. Mrs. Whitmore found them within 10 minutes, and pressed both of Margaret's hands in hers, and said in a low voice, "Ellison's response came to the county courthouse this morning. Official federal notice. Whatever Croft filed with aldermen, it's been flagged." "Already," Margaret said. "They moved fast," Mrs. Whitmore said. "I think having the Crawford records helped. The federal land office recognized the name." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 2 weeks. They were standing in that conversation when Silas Croft walked into the gathering. She saw him before Jackson did. He came in from the far end of the square, and he looked different. The easiness was entirely gone. What remained was the actual man underneath it, and he was thinner somehow, or maybe just less padded by performance. He looked like a man who had not slept well and knew that his situation was worse today than it had been yesterday. He saw her. Across the square through the crowd their eyes met. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away back to Mrs. Whitmore, back to the conversation, as if he were simply someone she had noticed in passing. She heard him begin to move through the crowd toward her. She tracked it in her peripheral vision without turning. He stopped about 10 feet away. He didn't come closer, which meant he was aware of the people around them, the gathering, the witnesses, the public nature of this space. He was calculating. And then he spoke loudly enough for the nearest cluster of people to hear. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "I've been wanting to ask, how are you finding the ranch? I understand it's been a considerable adjustment. Not everyone is suited to that kind of life." She recognized what he was doing immediately. Without the legal mechanisms available to him, without the hired men, without the documents in public at a community event, he was falling back on the oldest weapon available. Humiliation, the same weapon the town had used on her for 11 years. Make her small, make her a joke. Make people remember that she was the old maid who'd been handed to a rancher like a piece of unclaimed property. She turned to face him. Around them, the nearest conversations had dropped slightly in volume. People listening without appearing to listen, the specific frequency shift of a crowd tuning in. She was about to speak. And Jackson stepped forward. Not gently, not politely. He moved the way a man moves when he has completely finished being patient, and he placed himself beside her, not in front of her, not blocking her, but beside her close enough that the message was unmistakable, and he looked at Silas Croft with an expression she had not seen on him before, and hoped never to be on the receiving end of. "Croft," he said. Just the name, flat and hard as a closed door. The conversations around them fell further. "Jackson," Croft said with the last remnant of ease. "I was just asking your wife." "I know what you were doing," Jackson said. His voice was completely controlled and completely cold. "I also know what you've been doing for the past 2 years. The feed contracts, the altered filings, the authorization you had Harrington sign 4 months ago for a land reassessment that would have gone directly to your company." He paused. The prior conviction in Helena under the name Silas Crawford. The silence that fell over that corner of the gathering was absolute. Crawford. She watched the name land on the people around them, watched faces change, watched people look at each other, watched the specific ripple of a crowd processing something that rearranges everything they thought they understood about a situation. Croft's face went white. "That's," he started. "There's a federal notice at the county courthouse as of this morning," Jackson said. "Ellison and Gray and Bozeman filed it. You'll want to speak to an actual attorney. Not yourself doesn't count since you were disbarred in Helena 22 years ago and have been practicing illegally in this county." He held Croft's gaze without blinking. "Every document you filed is void. Every contract you altered is void. The declaration of abandonment you submitted 3 days ago is void and fraudulent. And the federal land office now has everything." Croft said nothing. He had nothing left to say. Around them, Willow Creek was listening. Every person who had voted Margaret Hale into a forced marriage because she was the woman no one wanted. Every person who had laughed or whispered or made space for Silas Croft's easy manner and plausible explanations. Every person who had spent 11 years treating a woman's silence as evidence of her worthlessness. "And one more thing," Jackson said. His voice dropped slightly, not softer, lower. "The specific register of a man saying something that matters more than the rest of it. My wife found all of this, in 2 weeks, with documents that everyone else had access to and chose not to read." He paused. "The woman this town picked because they thought she had no standing. The woman you chose because you thought she'd be easy to overlook." He looked at Croft steadily. "She was the only person in this county paying attention, and everything you built for 2 years is gone because of her." The silence stretched. Croft looked at Margaret for one last moment. She looked back at him with the expression she had used in the doorway of the ranch house, not triumph, not anger. Just the clear, level gaze of a woman who has been underestimated so many times that she has stopped being surprised by it and started simply using it. He turned. He walked away through the crowd, and the people parted for him, but not in the way they used to. Not with deference, not with the easy social accommodation people extend to someone they consider important. They parted to let him through because no one wanted to stand in his way, and that was a very different thing. Margaret stood in the middle of the harvest gathering in Willow Creek and watched him go. Around her, the crowd was very still. Then, Mrs. Whitmore, who was standing 3 feet away and had heard every word, began to clap. It was a single person's applause, steady and deliberate, and it was enough. Margaret felt Jackson's hand find hers. Not a dramatic gesture, just his hand closing around hers in the particular way of a man who has decided quietly and finally that this is where he is going to stand. She looked up at him. He looked at her, and for the first time since the church, since the wedding, since the aisle full of people waiting for her to break, she felt the thing she hadn't let herself feel in 11 years. Not safety, exactly. Something more active than safety. The feeling of being stood beside fully and publicly and without reservation by someone who had chosen to be there. Her eyes went bright. Just for a moment. She controlled it immediately the way she controlled everything, but he saw it. He was close enough that he couldn't have missed it. "You don't have to control everything," he said quietly, meant only for her. "Not right now." She looked at him for a long moment. Then the crowd began to move again, and someone began the music again, and the harvest gathering resumed around them, and Willow Creek began the slow process of rearranging its understanding of several things it had been wrong about for a very long time. Margaret Hale stood in the middle of it all with her hand in her husband's, and she thought about 11 years of silence, and one morning at the altar, and 2 weeks of ledgers and late nights, and a doorway she had refused to give ground in, and she thought about the smile that had begun as armor, and become something else over the course of 14 days in a house she hadn't chosen with a man she hadn't known. And she didn't smile now. Not the armor smile. Not the performance. But something in her face did something quietly that the people who looked at her later would describe differently, depending on who they were. Some would say she looked relieved. Some would say she looked triumphant. Some would say she looked like a woman who had finally put something down that she'd been carrying for too long. Mrs. Whitmore, who had known her the longest and the best, would say she simply looked like herself. For the first time completely, and without armor herself. The days after the harvest gathering moved differently than the days before it. Not easier exactly. There was still the federal case, still the paperwork, still the long process of unwinding 2 years of Croft's constructed damage from the official record. Ellison sent correspondence every few days, dense legal language that Margaret translated for Jackson at the kitchen table each evening, both of them leaning over the pages with their coffee going cold beside them, working through it the way they worked through everything now together in the specific shorthand of two people who had learned each other's thinking quickly and well. But the quality of the days had changed. The pressure that had sat in the base of her chest since the first morning, that constant low-level alertness of someone waiting for the next move in a game she hadn't chosen to play, had begun to lift. Not all at once. Gradually, the way dawn comes in Montana, not a single moment of light, but a slow accumulation of it, until you realize the dark is gone. Croft had not been seen in Willow Creek since the gathering. Harrington had submitted his formal statement to Ellison 3 days after writing it, and Ellison had confirmed by letter that the Federal Land Office had accepted it as supplementary evidence. Alderman at the clerk's office had been placed under federal review, which meant every filing Croft had submitted through his office was now under examination. The false declaration of abandonment had been formally voided within a week of the federal notice. The Eastern Grazing Territory stayed in Jackson's name. The contract renewal, once so precarious, was quietly approved by the Federal Land Office, with a notation in the file that the previous concerns had been resolved. It was Pruitt who brought that letter in from the mailbox at the end of the ranch road on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the gathering. He handed it to Margaret, who was in the yard, and she opened it and read it, and then she read it again. "Well," Pruitt said. She looked up at him. "It's done," she said. He let out a breath that had been held for a very long time. "All of it. All of it," she said. "The contract is renewed. The fraud finding is official. Croft Crawford has been reported to the territorial authorities under his legal name." She folded the letter. "It's done." Pruitt looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been through something difficult alongside someone and come out the other side with a clear understanding of what that someone is made of. "I'll go tell the boys," he said. She watched him walk toward the barn, and she stood in the yard alone with the letter in her hands and the Montana morning enormous around her, and she let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of what the past month had been, what it had cost, and what it had made. Then she went inside to find Jackson. He was in the office. He was always in the office. In the early morning she had learned this about him, the way she had learned all the rhythms of him, the way you learn a place by living in it. Early morning, the office. Mid-morning, the far fields. Afternoon, the barns or the corrals. Evening, back at the house. Sometimes the office again, if something needed finishing, sometimes the kitchen, where he would sit with his coffee, and occasionally say things that weren't small talk, but weren't declarations, either. Observations about the day, about the work, about the things he'd noticed, which turned out to be more than most people assumed. A quiet man noticed. She put the letter on the desk in front of him without speaking. He read it. She watched his face. It didn't break open. He wasn't that kind of man. But something in it released the same slow loosening she had felt in herself, visible in the set of his shoulders, and the particular quality of his exhale, and the way his hands went flat on the desk, in a posture that was different from the tight, controlled stillness he'd held for weeks. "Renewed," he said. "Renewed," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "Margaret." He said her name the way he had been saying it for the past 2 weeks, with a weight to it, a particularity, as if the name itself meant something specific to him that it hadn't meant before. "I had been losing this ranch for a year before you walked through that door. I didn't know it. I thought Croft was handling things correctly, and the accounts were off because of a hard season, and the contract would renew the way it always had." He paused. "You were here 14 days before you had found every piece of it. I had the advantage of fresh eyes," she said. "You had the advantage of being you," he said. "Don't minimize it. I've watched you do it since the first day. Minimize what you do, qualify. Make it sound like ordinary observation or simple practicality. It isn't." He held her gaze. "What you did in this house with those records and those documents, and Harrington and Ellison and Croft standing in the doorway. There are men in this county with 30 years of experience who couldn't have done what you did in a month." She looked at him for a long moment. The thing she always did, the instinct to qualify, to deflect, to fold the compliment down to something smaller and more manageable, rose in her, and she made herself not do it. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once. Then, "There's something I want to say. And I want to say it now, while the reason for it isn't the crisis or the pressure or the fact that we needed each other to get through something. I want to say it now that it's over, so there's no question about what it is." She was very still. "I don't experience this marriage as a contract," he said. "I haven't for a while. I'm not sure exactly when it changed, maybe the second night when you sat across from me at supper and said your mother's practicality had made you capable, and I thought I've never heard anyone describe grief that cleanly, maybe earlier." He paused. "It changed. And I'm not a man who says things I don't mean, so I'm telling you clearly this is not obligation. This is not gratitude for what you did with the records. This is not relief that the ranch is safe." He looked at her steadily, completely, the way he had looked at her from the very first day, that unguarded precision. This is something I would have wanted to find in a person regardless of any of it. And I found it in you." The room was quiet. She thought about the church, the aisle, the people waiting for her to look small, the borrowed dress with the repaired seam, the smile that had come from refusal. She thought about 11 years of building herself into something that could survive anything alone, and how that survival had always felt like winning and losing at the same time. "Jackson," she said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. But underneath it, something moved. "I came to this ranch prepared to be useful. I came prepared to be competent and practical, and to make the best of a situation neither of us chose." She stopped. "I was not prepared for you." "What does that mean?" he said quietly. "It means you looked at me," she said. "Not at what the town said I was, not at what Croft decided I was. You looked at me what I actually did, what I actually said, and you adjusted. Every time, from the first morning." She paused. I had forgotten what that felt like. Being seen without someone deciding in advance what they were going to see. He stood up from the desk. He came around it and stopped close to her the way he had stood in the kitchen weeks ago, near not touching with the specific intentionality of a man who moves deliberately. "I was slow," he said. "It took me 3 days to stop expecting someone else." "I've waited 11 years, she said. 3 days is nothing." "I know," he said, "but I'm still sorry for them." She looked up at him. The morning light was coming through the office window behind her, and the ranch was alive and working outside, and the letter with the contract renewal was on the desk, and everything that had been built in the past month. The trust, the partnership, the slow and specific accumulation of knowing each other was present in the room around them like a third thing. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just don't waste the time after them." He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, he raised one hand and touched her face. Just his hand against her cheek, brief and careful and real. And she felt it, the way you feel, something you have been quietly waiting for, without letting yourself know you were waiting. "I won't," he said. Mrs. Whitmore came to the ranch for the first time 2 days later. She came properly with a pie and an excuse about delivering it personally, and Margaret received her in the kitchen and made coffee, and they sat together the way they had sat in the back room of the shop many times, with the ease of two women who have been honest with each other through difficult things and arrived on the other side still standing. "The town is talking," Mrs. Whitmore said. "The town is always talking," Margaret said. "Yes, but differently now." The older woman wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Croft's real name is in circulation. Robert Alderman has submitted a voluntary cooperation statement to the federal office. Apparently he decided that getting ahead of it was better than waiting. Half of what Croft filed through him is being reviewed." She paused. "And people are reconsidering. Some things they thought they knew." "About Croft?" Margaret said. "About you," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly. Margaret looked at her coffee. "Agnes Beaumont came to see me," the older woman said. "Yesterday. It wasn't a comfortable conversation for either of us, but she asked about Thomas Reed, about what really happened." Mrs. Whitmore looked at her carefully. "I told her it wasn't my story to tell. But I think she knows she got the story wrong 11 years ago. I think several people know that now." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She thought about Agnes Beaumont, and 11 years of carefully tended narrative, the shape a lie takes when it sits in a community long enough to become history. "Does it matter anymore?" she said, not bitterly, with genuine uncertainty. "I think it might," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Not for the reason it would have mattered 10 years ago. Not because you need the town's approval." She paused. "But because you're going to live here, both of you, and the people around you, the ones who have children and families and lives that intersect with yours. How they understand what happened matters to the texture of your days." Margaret considered this. "You're right," she said. "I know you're right." "Thomas Reed's wife in Billings," Mrs. Whitmore said carefully. "Do you know what became of her?" "She remarried," Margaret said. "A few years after Thomas died." I heard through an indirect line. She seems to have built something decent." "Then the thing you protected by staying silent," the older woman said, "is no longer in the same danger it was." Margaret looked at her. "You don't have to tell anyone anything," Mrs. Whitmore said, "but you also don't have to keep carrying it the way you have been. The protection isn't required anymore." She paused. "You're allowed to let the truth exist." It was a simple thing to say. It was not a simple thing to absorb. Margaret sat with it in the way she sat with important things, fully without rushing toward a conclusion, letting it move through her at its own pace. "Let me think about it," she said. "Take all the time you need," Mrs. Whitmore said. "You've been carrying it 11 years. A few more days won't break anything." She told Jackson that evening. Not the version she had told him before, the bare bones, the essential shape. The full story. All of it the way she had told Mrs. Whitmore in the back room of the shop, the way she had not told anyone else. He listened the way he always listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You protected a woman you'd never met," he said, "and children who had nothing to do with what their father did. And you paid for it with 11 years of your life." "I made a choice," she said. "I'd make the same one again." "I know you would," he said. I'm not questioning the choice. I'm sitting with what it cost." He looked at her. "Did it ever feel like too much? In all that time, did you ever want to just say it, let it out, and let the chips fall?" She thought about it honestly. "Once," she said. "About 4 years in. There was a particularly bad week. Silas Croft was not yet in the picture, but there was another man, a merchant from the next town, who came to Willow Creek, and within 2 days had heard all of the town's version of me, and decided I was fair game for a specific kind of cruelty." She paused. "That week I came very close to telling everything, just to end it." "What stopped you?" "I thought about the children," she said. "They would have been 7 and 9 by then, old enough to hear things, old enough to be affected." She shook her head. "I couldn't do it." Jackson was quiet. Then, "The woman in Billings remarried." "Yes," she said. "Her children are grown, or nearly." "Nearly, yes." "Then the thing you were protecting," he said carefully, "is different now than it was." Mrs. Whitmore said the same thing. She said, "She's right." He looked at her. "You don't have to make a decision tonight. But I want you to know, whatever you decide, whatever you want to do with the truth of it, I'll stand beside you. In this town, in any room, in front of any person." He paused. "You won't be saying it alone." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's the thing," she said softly. "I've said everything alone for so long that I'm not sure I know how to do it any other way." "You'll learn," he said, simply, without fanfare, the way he said everything important. "You're fast." She almost laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, the almost lightness of it coming out of a conversation about the heaviest thing she carried. But that was what he did, she had learned. He didn't lighten things by making them smaller. He lightened them by being so plainly, solidly present that the weight distributed differently. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "All right," she said again. "I'll learn." The twist that came was not from Croft. It was not from Harrington or Alderman or any of the mechanisms of the legal battle that had occupied them for a month. It came from a direction none of them had been watching, which was the nature of the things that actually change you. They come from where you stopped looking. It came in the form of a letter, not to Margaret, to Jackson. Delivered to the ranch on a Friday in an envelope with a Billings postmark, addressed in an unfamiliar hand. Jackson brought it to the kitchen where Margaret was working, and he set it on the table in front of her without a word, because the return address was already visible and she had already seen it. Eleanor Reed, Billings, Montana Territory. She looked at the envelope for a long time. Thomas Reed's wife. Thomas Reed's widow. She did not touch it for a full minute. Jackson sat down across from her and said nothing, which was exactly right. Then she picked it up and opened it. The letter was 3 pages written in a careful, deliberate hand that spoke of someone who had rewritten it more than once before sending the final version. Margaret read it slowly, and her face did not change, but her eyes moved across the words with the specific attention she gave to things that mattered. When she finished, she put the pages down on the table. "She knows," she said. "What does she know?" Jackson said. "Everything," Margaret said. "She knew about Thomas and me. She knew about the engagement. She's known for years. She says she found correspondence after his death letters he'd kept that he shouldn't have." She paused. "She knew I never told the truth about what happened. She didn't know why not until recently." "How did she find out recently?" he said. "Someone wrote to her," Margaret said. "She doesn't say who, but someone in Willow Creek wrote to her and told her what had happened with Croft and the false marriage and the federal case. And she put it together." She looked at the letter again, picked up the 3rd page. She writes, Margaret said, slowly reading, "I have known for some years that you carried something for the sake of my children that was not yours to carry. I did not know how to address it. I was ashamed of my silence the same way I imagine you were sometimes ashamed of yours. My children are grown now. My eldest son is 17. My daughter is 15. They are good people. They have built their understanding of their father on a version that is incomplete. But they are strong enough for truth if it ever needs to be told. I leave that to you. I only wanted you to know at last and overdue that I know what you did. And I am sorry it cost you what it cost." The kitchen was quiet. Margaret set the page down. She was entirely still for a moment. Then something in her face shifted, not breaking, not dissolving, but changing the way ice changes in early spring, not melting into nothing but releasing from the shape it had been locked in. Her eyes went bright. She held it for a moment with the fierce control she had held everything for 11 years. And then she stopped holding it. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, a few tears that she didn't wipe away immediately, sitting across from her husband in their kitchen in the morning, holding a letter from a woman she had never met, who had just given her back something she hadn't known she was still waiting to receive. Jackson reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. He didn't speak. He didn't tell her it was all right, or that it was over now, or any of the things people say when they don't know what else to do with someone's pain. He just held her hand on the table and let her feel what she was feeling without making it smaller or hurrying it towards something more comfortable. She let herself feel it. All of it. The weight of 11 years releasing in the specific quiet of a kitchen that had become hers in a month, with a man who had become hers without either of them planning it, on a ranch that was safe now, and a case that was finished, and a letter on the table from Eleanor Reed in Billings that said, "I know. And I'm sorry." When she looked up, her eyes were still bright, but her expression was clear. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't let go of her hand. "She didn't have to write," Margaret said. "She could have stayed silent the same way I did. It would have been easier." "Some people choose the harder thing," Jackson said. "You know something about that." She looked at him. Then she looked at their joined hands on the table. Then slowly she turned her hand over so that her palm was against his. A deliberate gesture, a choice, the specific weight of a woman who has decided to stop holding things the way she held them alone and start holding them differently. "Yes," she said. "I do." The weeks that followed were the first ordinary weeks of her life in a very long time. Ordinary, in the best sense, full of work and purpose, and the specific texture of days that belonged to her. She took over the ranch accounts formally with Jackson's explicit request and Pruitt's open relief. She corresponded with Ellison as the federal case moved through its final stages. She wrote back to Eleanor Reed a letter that took her 4 evenings to finish, that she rewrote entirely twice, that she finally sent on a Tuesday morning, with the particular feeling of setting something down that had been in her arms for 11 years. She began talking to people in Willow Creek differently, not performing composure, not wearing the armor smile, just talking the way she might have talked if 11 years had gone another way, directly, warmly, with the dry wit she had mostly kept to herself, and which turned out when she let it out to make people laugh in a way that surprised her every time. Mrs. Whitmore threw a small dinner at the shop one evening. 4 women. Simple food, easy conversation. And Margaret sat at the table and talked about the ranch and the accounts, and a particularly stubborn problem with the north fence line, and she laughed twice in 2 hours, and neither laugh was armor. Agnes Beaumont came to see her. It was unexpected. She came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon alone, and she looked like a woman who had spent some time preparing herself for something unpleasant, and had decided to do it anyway, which Margaret respected on a practical level, even before the conversation began. "I owe you an apology," Agnes Beaumont said. She said it without preamble, standing in the yard with her hat in her hands. "What I spread about you, what I told people 11 years ago, and in the years since I was wrong. And I knew I was guessing, even at the time. I told the story that fit what I assumed, and I told it enough times that I stopped thinking of it as a guess." She looked at Margaret directly. "I'm sorry. It's inadequate and I know it, but I'm saying it anyway." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Agnes Beaumont was not a bad woman. She was a woman who had made bad choices with information she'd handled carelessly, and who had lived with the results of those choices more comfortably than she should have, and who was now standing in someone else's yard doing the uncomfortable work of saying so. "I appreciate you coming," Margaret said. "That took something." "It's the least of what's required," Agnes said. "It's the beginning of what's required," Margaret said. "That's enough for today." Agnes Beaumont nodded. She left. Margaret stood in the yard after she'd gone and thought about how the shape of things changes not all at once, not dramatically, but through the accumulation of moments like this, one person by person, choice by choice, until the town you've lived in for 11 years is slowly, imperfectly becoming something different. The final legal resolution came on a morning in late October. Ellison sent a formal notification. Silas Crawford, also known as Silas Croft, had been formally charged by the territorial authorities under his legal name for fraud, illegal practice of law, and falsification of public records. Robert Alderman had entered a cooperation agreement. The false filings were expunged from the county record. The coal ranch's contract stood clean renewed and documented accurately from the beginning. Jackson read the letter in the office and then brought it to Margaret in the kitchen garden, where she was putting the garden to bed for winter with the methodical attention she brought to everything. She read it. She handed it back. "It's finished," she said. "It's finished," he confirmed. She looked at the garden for a moment. Then she looked at him. "What do you want to do with the day?" she said. It was the kind of question she had not asked anyone in a very long time, an open, unguarded question, a question from someone who has enough space in their life to wonder what they want rather than only what they need. He thought about it. "Nothing urgent," he said, "for once." "Nothing urgent," she agreed. He sat down on the fence rail the way he had in the summer when she was in the garden, and he had come to sit near her without needing to be useful. She looked at him there, her husband who had started as a stranger on an altar in a church full of people, waiting for both of them to fail, who had become in the space of 2 months the clearest and most honest relationship she had ever had with another person. "I've been thinking," she said, about what Mrs. Whitmore said, about the town reconsidering things." She turned back to her work. "I've been thinking that I spent 11 years defining myself by what I survived. The town's version of me, Croft's use of me, Thomas Reed's betrayal. All of it I built myself around surviving those things. And I'm good at surviving. I know that now." She paused. "But I think I'm ready to build something around something else." He was quiet, listening the way he always listened. "I don't know exactly what yet," she said. "But I think it starts here. With the ranch, and the accounts, and the garden, and—" She looked at him directly. "And you." He looked back at her with the expression that was no longer the beginning of something. It was simply what he looked like now, when he looked at her open in a way that a man who had spent years alone learns to be only when he has found the specific person it's safe to be open with. "That sounds right to me," he said. "I know," she said. "I've noticed you tend to agree with me when I'm correct." "You're correct most of the time," he said. "Most," she repeated. "The fence on the north pasture," he said. "You said post-rot. I said weather damage." "It was post-rot," she said. "It was both," he said. She looked at him. He was almost smiling, that particular almost smile she had catalogued from the very first day in the church that she had been watching develop over 2 months into something that happened more often and required less provocation, that was becoming simply the way his face looked when he was near her and things were all right. She smiled back. Not the armor, not the performance, not the controlled, careful expression she had worn for 11 years as a shield against a town that had decided who she was before she could tell them herself. Just her smile. The real one. The one that had been waiting underneath everything for someone to make it safe to show. He saw it. He had seen it before, but he saw it now differently. The way you see something you've been watching from a distance and have finally gotten close enough to understand. "There it is," he said quietly. "What?" she said. "The smile," he said. "The real one." She held his gaze. "How do you know it's the real one?" "Because it changes your eyes," he said. "The other one doesn't." She was quiet for a moment. The Montana morning was enormous around them, the ranch working and alive in all directions. Everything that had been threatened, now secured. Everything that had been uncertain, now clear. "Jackson," she said. "Margaret," he said. "I'm glad they forced this," she said. "I'm glad it was you." He looked at her for a long moment, with everything he had decided without fanfare or declaration. Everything that had accumulated day by day in a house he had lived in alone for years and would not live in alone again. "So am I," he said. "Every day." She turned back to the garden. He stayed on the fence rail. The work continued, the way work does, the way life does, unhurried now and full of purpose, moving forward into all the ordinary, extraordinary days that were still ahead of them. The woman they had called the old maid of Willow Creek had never been broken. She had never been unwanted. She had never been the thing they said she was. She had simply been wading through 11 years of silence and survival, and a smile worn as armor for the one thing that all her competence and courage and careful management of everything could not produce for herself. Someone to finally stand beside her. She had found him in the last place anyone would have looked at the end of an aisle she hadn't chosen, in a church full of people waiting for her to fail beside a man who hadn't asked for her and had needed her more than he knew. And the woman who had survived everything alone discovered in the end that surviving together was not a lesser thing. It was the only thing worth building a life around.